The rain came down like judgment itself, cold, relentless, washing the blood from her knees as she stumbled through the forest behind the ceremonial hall. Each drop felt like accusation, like the moon goddess herself had turned her face away. Ilara's breath tore from her lungs in ragged gasps, her ceremonial dress, once pristine white silk meant to symbolize purity and hope, now hung in tatters, mud-stained and soaked through to her skin. The fabric clung to her trembling body, weighing her down as surely as the shame that burned in her chest. Behind her, the sounds of the mating ceremony continued. Laughter. Music. The howls of newly bonded pairs claiming each other under the full moon. The celebration that was supposed to include her. The night that was meant to be her salvation had become her execution. She pressed one hand against the rough bark of an ancient oak, her fingers scraping against the grooves as her legs threatened to give out completely. The forest floor was slick with fallen leaves and rain, treacherous beneath her bare feet. She'd lost her shoes somewhere back there in the hall, maybe, when Marcus had shoved her away. When he looked at her with such disgust that the entire gathered assembly had gone silent, watching, waiting to see what the pathetic Omega would do. Her wolf whimpered inside her, a broken sound that made Ilara's throat tighten with unshed tears. Even her own animal had gone quiet these past months, retreating so deep inside that sometimes Ilara wondered if she'd ever been there at all. Maybe everyone had been right. Maybe she was defective. Broken. Wrong in some fundamental way that made her unworthy of the most basic gift their kind was promised, a mate who would see her, choose her, claim her as something precious. Instead, Marcus had claimed his disgust for all to witness. Thunder rolled across the sky, and for a moment the lightning illuminated everything, the twisted branches overhead, the darkness pressing in from all sides, the path ahead that led deeper into territory she'd been warned never to enter alone. The borderlands between packs. The unclaimed forests where rogues hunted and ancient things still stirred in the shadows. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, stern and unyielding. These woods are forbidden for a reason, girl. Especially for an Omega. Especially for you, But where else could she go? Back to the ceremony where her humiliation still hung in the air like smoke? Back to her pack where every eye would hold either pity or satisfaction. The elders had made it clear enough over the years. She was a burden they tolerated only because pack law demanded it. An Omega without grace, without the sweetness and submission that was supposed to define her designation. Too sharp-tongued. Too questioning. Too much of something and not nearly enough of everything else. Ilara pushed away from the tree and forced herself forward, her feet slipping on the wet ground. The cold had seeped into her bones now, making her movements clumsy, desperate. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to preserve what little warmth remained, but it was useless. Everything was useless. The dress, the ceremony, the hope she'd clung to like a lifeline that Marcus might look past her designation and see something worth keeping. I, Marcus Thorne of the Crescent Shadow Pack, reject you, Ilara Winters, as my mate. I will not be bound to a wolf who barely has a scent, who can hardly shift, who brings nothing but weakness to my bloodline. The moon goddess made a mistake, and I will not pay for it with my future. The words had been formal, ritualistic, spoken with the weight of pack law behind them. But the contempt in his voice, that had been personal. That had been meant to cut deep, to ensure everyone understood she wasn't just rejected but fundamentally rejectable. The kind of wolf who couldn't hold a bond even when fate itself tried to forge one. She'd felt the mate bond snap like a physical thing, like invisible threads being severed one by one inside her chest. The pain had driven her to her knees right there in the ceremonial circle, gasping, while the assembled wolves had watched with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction. Someone had whispered that it was mercy, really, that Marcus had been strong enough to break a flawed bond before it could weaken them both. Ilara had run before the whispers could become shouts, before the pity could transform into something sharper. Before her mother's face could crumple into that familiar expression of disappointed resignation, the one that said, "I knew you would fail us eventually." A branch snapped somewhere to her left, and Alara froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she strained to hear over the rain, over the thunder of her own pulse in her ears. The forest had gone quiet, no birds, no small creatures rustling through the underbrush. Just the steady drum of rain and that terrible, watching silence that made her skin prickle with warning. She wasn't alone. Her wolf stirred, finally, pressing against her consciousness with urgency that bordered on panic. "Run," her animal seemed to say. "Run now," but Alara's legs felt rooted to the spot, her body frozen between the instinct to flee and the exhausted resignation that maybe it didn't matter anymore. Maybe being torn apart by rogues in the forbidden forest was just another kind of ending, no worse than the slow death of returning home to a pack that had never wanted her. Another sound, closer this time. The soft pat of paws on wet earth. Multiple sets, moving with the coordinated silence of hunters who knew their territory. Alara's breath came faster, sharper, as she finally unfroze and stumbled backward. Her foot caught on an exposed root, and she went down hard, her palms slamming into the mud, pain shooting up her wrists. And that's when she saw them. Eyes in the darkness. Yellow. Gleaming. At least 4 sets, maybe more, circling through the trees with predatory patience. Rogues. Had to be. No pack wolf would hunt another wolf like this, not with this kind of calculated menace. These were the ones who'd rejected pack law entirely, who'd let their animals take over until there was barely anything human left. Alara's wolf surged forward suddenly, desperately, trying to force a shift that her body had never been able to complete properly. The transformation began, bones cracking, tendons stretching, but stopped halfway, leaving her gasping in agony as her body fought itself. Too weak. Too broken. Even now, when her life depended on it, she couldn't manage what every other wolf could do without thinking. The rogues moved closer, their forms taking shape in the darkness. Big males, their fur matted and scarred, their teeth bared in anticipation. One of them, the largest, with a torn ear and cold, dead eyes, stepped fully into view. He was in that half-form some dominant wolves could hold, standing on 2 legs, but covered in fur, claws extended, powerful enough to tear her apart with casual effort. Alara's back hit a tree. Nowhere left to run. She pressed against the bark, her hands scraping for anything, a branch, a rock, anything she could use as a weapon. Her fingers closed around something half buried in the mud, and she pulled it free. A piece of dead wood, rotted and soft, useless against what was coming for her. The lead rogue made a sound, not quite a growl, not quite a laugh. Mocking. They could smell her fear, could sense her weakness. And Omega alone, rejected, barely able to shift. Easy prey. Maybe even entertainment before they finished her. This is it, Alara thought with strange clarity. This is how it ends, not in the glory of battle, not defending her pack, not even in the quiet dignity of old age. But here, in the forbidden forest, torn apart by rogues because she'd been too proud to endure the humiliation of staying at a ceremony where no one wanted her. The lead rogue took another step forward, and Alara raised her pathetic piece of wood with shaking hands, knowing it would do nothing but delay the inevitable by seconds. Her wolf was screaming inside her now, thrashing, trying desperately to break free and at least give them a fight. But her body wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't transform, wouldn't do the one thing that might save her life. The rain came down harder, the storm reaching its peak, and somewhere in the distance another sound cut through the chaos, a howl that made every rogue freeze mid-step. It was unlike anything Alara had ever heard. Deep, commanding, ancient. It resonated through the forest like a shockwave, making the very trees seem to shudder, making the rain itself pause for a heartbeat. The rogues' confidence shattered instantly. Their ears flattened, their tails tucked, and the lead male actually took a step backward, his dead eyes suddenly alive with something Alara recognized because she'd felt it herself tonight, fear. Another howl answered the first, closer this time, and then the forest exploded with movement. Massive shapes materialized from the darkness, wolves so large they made the rogues look like pups. Their fur was darker than midnight, their eyes gleaming with intelligence and purpose. They moved with military precision, cutting off every escape route, surrounding the rogues with the efficiency of trained warriors. The lead rogue tried to run. He made it 3 steps before one of the massive wolves slammed into him, taking him down with brutal force. The others scattered, but it was useless. The newcomers were faster, stronger, coordinated. Within seconds, every rogue was either pinned or fleeing into the forest with massive wolves in pursuit. Elara's legs finally gave out completely, and she slid down the tree trunk, landing hard in the mud. Her chest heaved as she tried to process what she was seeing, tried to understand what pack could command wolves this size, this powerful. Not her own, Crescent Shadow's warriors were strong, but nothing like this. These were something else entirely. And then the largest of them approached her. He moved through the rain like it parted for him, his dark fur slick with water, his eyes, not yellow, not the typical gold of pack wolves, but silver, fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was enormous, easily twice the size of any wolf she'd ever seen, his presence radiating power so profound it made the air feel heavy. Elara should have been terrified. Should have scrambled away, should have screamed, should have done something other than sit there in the mud and stare as this massive creature stopped 3 feet away and lowered his head to her level. Their eyes met, and the world tilted. Something snapped into place inside her chest, not the mate bond that Marcus had broken, but something older, deeper, more primal. Her wolf stopped thrashing and went utterly still, focused entirely on the massive male before them. Recognition blazed through Elara's mind, her animal's mind, some ancient instinct that whispered safe and home, and mine with such certainty that she couldn't doubt it. The massive wolf shifted. The transformation was seamless, powerful, nothing like her own painful attempts. One moment he was a wolf, the next a man crouched before her in the rain. He was bare-chested, heavily muscled, his dark hair plastered to his head, his silver eyes still locked on hers. There was something covering the upper half of his face, a mask, she realized, simple and black, concealing his features while leaving his strong jaw and sensual mouth visible. When he spoke, his voice was rough, low, carrying the same command his howl had held, but tempered with something unexpected. Concern. You're hurt. It wasn't a question. His gaze traveled over her torn dress, her muddy knees, her scraped palms still clutching that useless piece of wood. Elara couldn't find her voice. Couldn't process how this stranger, this impossibly powerful alpha, because he had to be an alpha, nothing else could explain the authority rolling off him in waves, knew to look at her like that. Like she was something fragile he was afraid might shatter. Her voice cracked, and she hated how weak she sounded, how broken. I'm fine. You're not fine. He moved closer, and Elara's entire body tensed. But he didn't touch her, didn't reach for her the way Marcus had sometimes grabbed her carelessly, possessively, like she was a thing to be positioned rather than a person to be considered. Instead, the stranger, this alpha, kept his hands visible, his movements careful. Those rogues would have torn you apart. What are you doing out here alone? The question should have been accusatory, but it wasn't. It was genuine, confused, as if the idea of anyone leaving her unprotected was personally offensive to him. Elara's laugh came out bitter, broken. Running. Hiding. Take your pick. She finally dropped the piece of wood, her fingers cramping from how hard she'd been gripping it. It doesn't matter. Thank you for the rescue, but I should. Your name. The command in his voice made her wolf sit up and pay attention, made Elara's mouth answer before her brain could consider whether it was wise to tell a strange alpha anything about herself. Elara. Elara Winters. Something flickered in those silver eyes. Recognition? Satisfaction? It was gone before she could identify it, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. Elara, he repeated, and the way he said it. Like he was tasting the syllables, like her name was something precious he'd been searching for, made heat bloom in her chest despite the cold rain soaking them both. I'm Kale. Another voice cut through the storm, sharp and urgent. We need to move. The border patrol will be here soon, and we can't afford questions. The alpha, Kale, didn't take his eyes off Alara, but his jaw tightened with obvious frustration. Around them, his warriors were reforming, massive wolves emerging from the forest with practiced efficiency. The rogues were either gone or dead, the immediate danger eliminated with swift precision. "I heard you," Kale called back, his tone suggesting whoever had spoken should exercise patience. His attention returned to Alara, and this time he did reach out, offering his hand. "Come with me." It wasn't a request. Wasn't quite a command either. Something in between, waited with expectation, but leaving her space to refuse. Alara stared at his hand, large, scarred, strong enough to kill, but extended with careful gentleness. Her mind screamed warnings. She didn't know this male. Didn't know his pack, his intentions, why he'd been in these woods at the exact moment she needed saving. Going with him was foolish, dangerous, possibly suicidal. But staying here meant returning to Crescent Shadow. Meant facing Marcus and his new mate, whoever he'd chosen instead. Meant living under the weight of tonight's rejection for the rest of her life, watching the pity and contempt in every eye she met. And this alpha, this Kale, had looked at her like she mattered. Like the sight of her hurt had genuinely angered him. Like she was something worth protecting rather than something to be cast aside. Before she could second-guess herself, before logic could override instinct, Alara placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm despite the rain, and that strange sensation in her chest blazed brighter. Kale pulled her to her feet with effortless strength, steadying her when she swayed, his other hand hovering near her waist without actually touching. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice dropping lower, more intimate, like they were the only two people in the forest despite his warriors watching from the shadows. Alara nodded, not trusting her voice. Everything hurt, her feet, her knees, her chest where the broken mate bond still ached, but she could walk. She would walk. She would not be carried like some helpless thing, not even by an alpha whose touch made her wolf purr contentedly for the first time in months. If you're already hooked by this tale of broken bonds and mysterious saviors, hit that subscribe button for Shayla's Romance Library, because this story is just beginning. And you won't want to miss what happens when a rejected Omega catches the attention of an alpha who was never supposed to exist. Kale kept her hand in his as he led her deeper into the forest, moving away from the ceremonial hall, away from Crescent Shadow territory, toward something unknown. His warriors fell into formation around them, protective, vigilant, their massive forms creating a living barrier between Alara and the world that had tried to destroy her. She should have been afraid. Should have demanded answers, insisted on knowing where they were going, who he really was beneath that mask. But exhaustion was setting in now, the adrenaline fading, leaving her hollow and shaking. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion, beneath the pain, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, running into the forbidden forest had been the first right choice she'd made in years. The rain continued to fall, washing away the evidence of the mating ceremony, washing away the blood and mud, washing away everything except the feeling of Kale's hand wrapped around hers, steady, warm, inexplicably certain. In the distance, she could still hear the faint sounds of celebration from the hall she'd fled. Wolves claiming their mates, beginning their futures, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded in their midst. Marcus was probably already dancing with someone new, already erasing her from his thoughts, already proving to his pack that rejecting her had been the right decision. Let him, Alara thought with sudden fierce clarity. Let them all think they'd won by casting her out. She'd find her own way forward, even if it meant following a masked alpha into the unknown, even if it meant gambling her safety on the strange certainty she felt every time Kale looked at her with those silver eyes. The forest grew denser, the path more treacherous, but Kale navigated it with easy confidence, adjusting his pace when she stumbled, his grip on her hand never faltering. Once, when she slipped on a particularly slick patch of ground, he caught her against his chest, his arms coming around her with surprising gentleness, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "I've got you." 3 simple words, but they carried weight. Promise. Certainty. Like he decided she was his responsibility now, his to protect, and nothing would change his mind. Alara's wolf hummed with approval, and for the first time in hours, maybe months, maybe years, she let herself relax against someone's strength instead of forcing herself to stand alone. Just for a moment. Just until they reached wherever Kale was taking her. The storm raged on, thunder shaking the sky, lightning illuminating brief flashes of the world around them. But inside the circle of Kale's arms, sheltered by his massive frame, Alara felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Possibility. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, moving through sections of forest Alara had never seen despite living her entire life near these woods. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches forming canopies so dense that even the rain barely penetrated. The ground beneath her feet changed from mud to moss, soft and almost warm, like the forest itself was trying to cushion her steps. Kale never released her hand. His warriors moved around them like shadows, silent and vigilant, their presence both comforting and unsettling. These weren't ordinary pack wolves. Everything about them spoke of discipline, training, purpose. They moved with the precision of soldiers who'd fought together countless times, who trusted each other implicitly, who would die for their alpha without hesitation. It made Alara wonder exactly what kind of pack she'd stumbled into. What kind of alpha commanded this level of loyalty? Finally, they emerged into a clearing that shouldn't have existed. The rain stopped abruptly at its edge, like an invisible barrier held back the storm. In the center stood a structure that was half ruins, half functional shelter, ancient stone walls covered in climbing vines, a partially intact roof that created a protected space beneath. Intricate carvings weathered by centuries, but still visible in the moonlight that suddenly broke through the clouds overhead. It was beautiful. Haunting. Sacred in a way that made Alara's wolf stir with recognition, like they'd been here before in dreams or distant memories. What is this place? Her voice came out barely above a whisper, hushed by the weight of reverence pressing down on her. Kale guided her toward the shelter, his hand finally releasing hers to gesture at the ruins. An old meeting ground. Neutral territory between packs, back when such things existed. Now it's just forgotten. He glanced at her, those silver eyes catching the moonlight. No one comes here anymore. You'll be safe while the storm passes. Safe. That word again, like it was personally important to him that she felt it. Inside the shelter, his warriors had already started a fire in what remained of an ancient hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows across the stone walls, illuminating the carvings Alara had glimpsed outside. They depicted wolves in various forms. Running, hunting, howling at moons that seemed almost three-dimensional in their detail. And between the wolves, symbols she didn't recognize. Spirals and crescents and something that looked almost like flames rising from outstretched hands. One of the warriors approached, a female with dark hair braided back from a scarred face, her eyes sharp and assessing as she took in Alara's bedraggled state. She carried a bundle which she offered to Kale without a word, then retreated to join the others positioning themselves around the clearing's perimeter. Kale unfolded the bundle, revealing dry clothes, simple pants and a tunic, too large for Alara but clean and warm-looking. He held them out to her, his expression unreadable behind that mask. "Change," he said quietly. "You'll catch your death in those wet things." Alara took the clothes with trembling fingers, suddenly aware of how thoroughly soaked she was, how the cold had settled into her bones. But she hesitated, glancing around at the warriors, at Kale himself, hyper-conscious of the vulnerability required to undress, even partially. Kale seemed to understand without her saying anything. He moved to the entrance, positioning himself with his back to her, creating a physical barrier between Alara and his warriors. "No one will look. You have my word." It was the certainty in his voice that made her believe him. Not arrogance, not casual dismissal of her concerns, but absolute conviction that his word meant something, that his warriors would obey without question because he'd commanded it. Alara turned toward the fire, using its warmth and light to guide her shaking hands as she peeled off the ruined ceremonial dress. The fabric clung to her skin, reluctant to release her, like even her clothes wanted to remind her of the humiliation she'd endured. She let it fall to the ground in a sodden heap, not caring if she ever saw it again. The dry clothes were enormous on her frame, the pants requiring her to roll the waistband several times, the tunic hanging nearly to her knees. But they were warm and soft, and the moment she pulled them on, she felt marginally more human. Less like a broken thing and more like a person who might survive the night. "I'm decent," she said, and immediately cringed at the word choice. Decent. What a joke, when just hours ago she'd been publicly declared the opposite by the male who was supposed to want her above all others. Cale turned, his gaze sweeping over her once before settling on her face. Something flickered in those silver eyes, approval, maybe, or satisfaction, but he didn't comment on her appearance. Instead, he moved to the fire and lowered himself to sit on a flat stone that might have once been part of a bench or altar. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the space beside the fire. "Warm up." Elara approached cautiously, still not entirely sure what was happening, why this powerful alpha was showing her kindness when kindness had been so thoroughly absent from her life tonight. She sat on the ground near the flames, drawing her knees up and wrapping her arms around them, trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. Cale studied her for a long moment, his expression hidden behind that infuriating mask, but his body language suggesting thought, consideration, perhaps internal debate about what to say next. Finally, he spoke. "I know who you are, Elara Winters." Her head snapped up, heart suddenly pounding. "What?" "I know your pack. Crescent Shadow. I know your designation." His voice remained neutral, stating facts without judgment. "And I know what happened tonight at the mating ceremony." Ice flooded Elara's veins, replacing the warmth the fire had begun to provide. Of course. Of course he knew. Everyone would know by morning. The rejected Omega who couldn't even hold a bond. The defective wolf who'd embarrassed her mate so thoroughly he'd had to publicly cast her aside. She started to stand, humiliation burning through her. "Then you know what I am. What I'm not. You don't need to pretend. Sit down." The command in his voice froze her mid-movement. Not harsh, not cruel, but absolutely unyielding. The voice of an alpha who expected obedience not because he demanded it, but because he'd earned the right to it. Elara sat. Cale leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his silver eyes locked on hers with unnerving intensity. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" She couldn't answer. Couldn't imagine what someone like him, powerful, commanding, clearly alpha in every sense of the word, could possibly see in someone like her. "I see a wolf who walked into those woods alone," Cale continued, his voice dropping lower, more intimate. "Who faced down rogues with nothing but a piece of rotten wood. Who didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't break even when death was staring her in the face." He paused, letting the words sink in. "That's not weakness, Elara. That's not defect. That's strength most wolves never find in their entire lives." The words hit her like physical blows, each one landing somewhere in her chest, somewhere near that hollow space the broken mate bond had left behind. She wanted to believe him, wanted so desperately to think there was something valuable in her survival instinct, in her stubborn refusal to give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing her truly broken. But wanting to believe and actually believing were different things. "You don't understand," she whispered, hating how her voice shook. "I can barely shift. My wolf is she's broken, or I'm broken, or something is fundamentally wrong with me. Marcus was right to reject me. Any alpha would be." Cale's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge that made her wolf sit up and take notice. "Marcus Thorne is a fool who wouldn't recognize true strength if it tore his throat out. And any alpha who agrees with him doesn't deserve the title." The vehemence in his tone startled her. This wasn't polite disagreement or generic reassurance. This was genuine anger, directed not at her but at the system that had deemed her worthless, at the male who'd rejected her, at everyone who'd made her believe she was less than she should be. Why do you care? The question escaped before Alara could stop it. You don't know me. We've never met. Why does any of this matter to you? Kale was silent for a long moment, and Alara watched emotions flicker across the visible parts of his face, conflict, hesitation, something that looked almost like longing. When he finally answered, his words were carefully chosen, measured. Because I've been watching you, Alara Winters. For longer than you know. The admission should have been creepy, should have sent alarm bells ringing through her head. Instead, it explained something. That flash of recognition in his eyes when she'd first said her name, the way he'd moved to protect her with such certainty, like he'd been waiting for exactly that moment. Watching me, she echoed. Why? Because 3 months ago, I had a vision. Kale's voice took on a quality she hadn't heard before, something reverent, almost odd. The moon goddess herself appeared in my dreams, showed me a wolf crying in the rain. A female with fire in her veins and power she didn't understand. She told me that when the time came, when this wolf was at her lowest point, I would find her. I would claim her. And together we would change everything. Alara's breath caught. Prophecy. Vision. The moon goddess speaking directly to an alpha. These were things from stories, from legends, not from real life. Not from her pathetic, broken existence. That's impossible, she whispered. The goddess doesn't, she wouldn't. Why would she care about someone like me? I don't know. Kale's honesty was unexpected, refreshing. I've asked that question every night since the vision. I've searched for you, followed rumors about Crescent Shadow's youngest Omega, waited for the ceremony I knew would happen. And tonight, when I felt your pain, he stopped abruptly, his hand moving to his chest, right over his heart. I felt it here. Your anguish. Your humiliation. Like it was my own. Understanding crashed through Alara like a wave. Not the mate bond. That had been severed, was lying in pieces somewhere in the ceremonial hall. But something else. Something the moon goddess had woven between them before they'd ever met. You're insane, she said, but there was no conviction behind the words. Because deep down, in that place where her wolf lived, she felt it too. That pull toward him. That inexplicable certainty that despite everything logical and reasonable, Kale was somehow right. That this strange alpha with his silver eyes and hidden face was important. Essential, even. Probably, Kale agreed with a ghost of a smile. But insanity seems to run in the bloodline. He stood abruptly, moving to the entrance of the shelter, his gaze scanning the forest beyond. His warriors were still out there, maintaining their protective perimeter, waiting for his orders. Alara watched him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like someone carrying invisible weight. An alpha's burden, multiplied by something she didn't understand yet. What pack are you from? She asked. I've never seen wolves like yours. Never heard of silver-eyed alphas who receive visions and command warriors like those. Kale turned back to her, and even with half his face hidden, she could read the hesitation in his posture. Whatever answer he was about to give, it was important. Possibly dangerous. I don't have a pack, he said finally. Not in the traditional sense. I have followers. Warriors who chose to serve me when their own packs cast them out. Rogues who found purpose when I offered them something more than survival. Outcasts and misfits who society deemed unworthy. His silver eyes found hers again, holding her captive. Much like yourself. The words settled between them, heavy with implication. He was building something outside the normal pack structure. Something that would be considered dangerous, possibly treasonous, by the established orders. The alphas who controlled territories and decided fates would view him as a threat to their authority. You're creating your own pack, Alara said slowly. From wolves no one else wanted. I'm creating a family, Kale corrected. For wolves who deserve better than what they were given. And yes, the other alphas fear what that might mean. Fear the questions it raises about their own power structures. They'll come after you. It wasn't a question. If they find out what you're doing, they'll unite against you. Let them try. The confidence in his voice wasn't arrogance. It was certainty born from strength he had no reason to doubt. I've been preparing for that confrontation since the day I first claimed my authority. They can bring their armies, their laws, their judgments. It won't change what I know to be true. And what's that? Alara asked, leaning forward despite herself, drawn into his conviction. Kale crossed back to her, lowering himself to crouch directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could count the flecks of darker silver in his eyes. That the old ways are dying, he said softly. That pack hierarchy built on designation and bloodline alone is fundamentally flawed. That wolves like you, with strength that doesn't fit their neat categories, are exactly what our kind needs to survive what's coming. What's coming? The question emerged as barely a whisper. Before Kale could answer, one of his warriors appeared at the entrance, the scarred female from earlier, her expression urgent. Kale. Border Patrol just passed. They're searching for someone. Her gaze flicked to Alara. They're calling for the Omega, saying she's disturbed, dangerous, that she attacked her mate and fled into rogue territory. Rage exploded across Kale's face so suddenly, so intensely, that Alara actually flinched backward. He rose to his full height, his hands clenching into fists, power rolling off him in waves that made the air feel thick, electric. They dare, his voice was barely human, more growl than words. They reject her, humiliate her, leave her defenseless, and now they spin lies to justify hunting her down? The warrior stood her ground, clearly accustomed to her alpha's temper. They have trackers. They'll find this place eventually. No, Kale's tone brooked no argument. They won't. Not while I draw breath. He turned back to Alara, and the rage in his expression transformed into something else. Something that looked almost like possessiveness. You're under my protection now. Do you understand? No one touches you. No one takes you. No one so much as speaks your name with disrespect. Alara should have been afraid of that intensity, that barely controlled fury directed at anyone who might threaten her. Instead, she felt her wolf rise up, proud and strong for the first time in months, preening under the weight of an alpha's claim. Because that's what this was. Not a mate bond, not yet, maybe never. But a claim nonetheless. Kale was declaring her as his, putting his considerable power between her and everyone who'd ever hurt her. I understand, she said, and meant it. But they'll never stop looking. My pack doesn't tolerate wolves who run. And if they're already spreading lies, then we give them truth. Kale's smile was sharp, dangerous, promising violence to anyone foolish enough to stand in his way. The kind of truth they can't ignore or twist. The kind that forces them to face exactly what they threw away when they broke you. He extended his hand again, palm up, offering. Come with me, Alara. Not just for tonight, not just until the storm passes. Come with me, join my family, and I swear on everything I am that you will never be dismissed or diminished again. I swear that your wolf will find her voice, her strength, her rightful place. And I swear that anyone who tries to hurt you will have to go through me first. It was madness. Complete, utter insanity. She'd known this alpha for maybe an hour. Knew nothing about him except that he had visions and collected outcasts and commanded loyalty that bordered on worship. Running off with him meant abandoning her pack completely, burning every bridge, embracing a life outside the only structure she'd ever known. But what did she have to stay for? Marcus's contempt? Her pack's pity? A designation that marked her as weak in their eyes? Years of proving herself over and over to wolves who'd already decided she wasn't worth their respect. Alara looked at Kale's outstretched hand, strong, scarred, steady. Looked at his silver eyes blazing with conviction and promise. Felt her wolf's certainty humming through every nerve. For the second time that night, she made the choice that would change everything. She placed her hand in his, and this time, she held on tight. Then I'm yours, she said, the words feeling both terrifying and absolutely right. Whatever that means. Wherever that leads. I'm yours. The smile that broke across Kale's face was devastating, transforming his features from harsh and dangerous to something almost beautiful. His fingers tightened around hers, and that strange warmth in her chest blazed brighter, stronger, like something dormant had finally been given permission to wake. And I am yours, Alara Winters, he replied, formal and binding. From this moment until my last breath. I claim you, I protect you, I see you. Every part of you that they said was broken, I recognize as whole. Every piece of you they deemed worthless, I treasure as precious. You are mine, and I am yours, and anyone who challenges that will learn exactly why the moon goddess sent me visions in the first place. The other warriors materialized from the forest, forming a circle around the shelter. They dropped to one knee in perfect synchronization, heads bowed, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. Witnessing, accepting, welcoming her into whatever strange family Kale had built from society's rejected pieces. Elara's throat tightened with emotion she couldn't name. Not happiness, exactly. Not relief. Something bigger, more profound. Like she'd been wandering lost for years and had finally, impossibly, stumbled onto the right path. Kale pulled her closer, his free hand coming up to cup her face with surprising gentleness. "They're going to regret ever making you cry," he said softly, meant only for her. "I'm going to make sure of it." And looking into those silver eyes, feeling the absolute certainty of his claim, Elara believed him. The storm raged on outside their protective bubble, but inside, by the fire, surrounded by warriors who'd chosen to follow an alpha society feared, Elara felt something she'd never experienced before in Crescent Shadow. She felt like she belonged. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling upward through the broken sections of the ancient roof. Elara sat with her back against the stone wall, Kale's borrowed tunic still hanging loose on her frame, watching the flames dance while her mind replayed the night's events in an endless, torturous loop. His warriors had withdrawn to give them privacy, though she could sense them out there in the darkness, vigilant sentinels ensuring no one from Crescent Shadow could reach her. Kale sat nearby, close enough that she could feel his presence like a physical weight, but far enough to give her space to breathe, to process, to exist without expectation. He'd removed his outer cloak and sat bare-chested except for the leather straps that held various weapons, a warrior even at rest, always prepared for violence. The firelight played across the scars marking his torso, each one telling a story of battles fought and survived. She should have felt safe. Should have been grateful for the rescue, for the claim, for the protection of an alpha powerful enough to stand against her entire former pack. And part of her did feel those things, felt them deeply, desperately. But another part, the part that had learned not to trust good things because they always came with conditions, with prices she couldn't afford to pay, kept waiting for the moment Kale would reveal what he really wanted from her. What service or submission or sacrifice would be required in exchange for his protection? Because nothing came free. Her life had taught her that lesson over and over, carved it into her bones with relentless consistency. "You're thinking too loud," Kale said quietly, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I can practically hear the spiraling from here." Elara's joy tightened. "I'm fine. You're not." He turned toward her then, those silver eyes finding hers in the firelight. "And you don't have to be. Not here. Not with me." The gentleness in his voice made something crack inside her chest, made the careful walls she'd built start to crumble. She looked away, focusing on the fire instead of his too perceptive gaze, her hands clenching in the fabric of the tunic. "You said you've been watching me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For 3 months. So you know, don't you? You know what I am. What's wrong with me?" Kale was silent for a moment, and she could feel him choosing his words carefully. "I know what they say about you. I know the stories Crescent Shadow tells. But I'd like to hear the truth from you if you're willing to share it." Of course he would. Of course he'd want her version, want to understand the brokenness he'd claimed responsibility for. Elara closed her eyes, the memories rising like bile in her throat, bitter and inescapable. "I was 7 when they realized something was wrong with me," she began, the words coming slowly at first, rusty from disuse. She never talked about this. Never let herself dwell on the progression of disappointments that had defined her childhood. Most wolves have their first shift around 5 or 6. Mine didn't come. My parents thought I was just a late bloomer, that my wolf was shy or hesitant. They were patient at first. She could still remember those early years, when her mother had smiled encouragingly and her father had insisted she just needed more time, more training, more exposure to the pack's energy during full moons. When they'd still believed she would be normal eventually. When I was 8, I finally managed a partial shift. Just my hands, just for a few seconds, but it was something. Everyone celebrated like I'd done something miraculous. The memory tasted sour now, knowing how quickly that celebration had transformed into concern, then frustration, then barely concealed disappointment. But it never progressed beyond that. Partial shifts that hurt so badly I'd scream. Transformations that stopped halfway, leaving me trapped between forms until someone stronger had to force me back to human. Kale made a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh. Sympathy, maybe? Or anger on her behalf. She couldn't tell which, and didn't want to look at his face to find out. The pack healers examined me over and over. They couldn't find anything physically wrong. My wolf was there, they could sense her, could feel her presence. But something was blocking her, preventing her from fully emerging. They called it a developmental abnormality. A spiritual defect. Some kind of cosmic joke the moon goddess had played on my bloodline. Her hands were shaking now, and she pressed them flat against her thighs to still them. My designation presented when I was 13. Omega. The lowest rank, meant to be gentle and nurturing and submissive. Except I was none of those things. I was angry and frustrated and constantly questioning why the goddess would curse me with a designation I couldn't fulfill properly because my wolf wouldn't cooperate. The fire popped loudly, making her flinch. Kale didn't move, didn't interrupt, just listened with that focused intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and understood. The other Omegas could shift easily, gracefully. They moved through packed spaces with this natural sweetness that made everyone want to protect them, nurture them. I just made people uncomfortable. Too sharp-tongued for an Omega. Too angry. Too broken. She laughed bitterly. My mother used to cry about it. She'd say I was wasting my designation, that if I just tried harder to be softer, maybe my wolf would feel safe enough to emerge. Your mother blamed you, Kale said flatly, and the edge in his voice made Alara look up despite herself. His expression was dark, controlled fury radiating from every line of his body. She blamed a child for something completely outside her control. She was disappointed, Alara defended automatically, even though she'd spent years resenting that same disappointment, that sense of never being enough. They both were. I wasn't the daughter they'd imagined having. Wasn't the wolf they could be proud of. They were fools, Kale said bluntly. Blind, short-sighted fools who couldn't see what was right in front of them. Alara shook her head, not ready to accept that reframing, not after years of internalizing her parents' judgment as truth. You don't understand. In a pack like Crescent Shadow, weakness is barely tolerated. A wolf who can't shift properly is a liability. They kept me fed and housed because pack law demanded it, but everyone knew I'd never contribute anything meaningful. Never be worthy of a position or respect or a mate, Kale finished softly, understanding dawning in his eyes. They told you no one would ever want a broken Omega. The words hit like physical blows, accurate and devastating. Not in so many words. But it was implied in every pitying look, every conversation that stopped when I entered a room, every unmated male who avoided me like I was contagious. She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller. When Marcus's scent matched mine during last year's trials, everyone was shocked. He was mid-rank, not particularly powerful but solid, respectable. And he'd been matched with me. She could still remember the disbelief on her mother's face, the way her father had actually smiled for the first time in years. Like maybe, just maybe, the goddess hadn't completely forsaken their family after all. Marcus wasn't happy about it, Alara continued, the memories cutting deep even now. He made that clear from the beginning. But pack law said we had to wait a year before we could formally accept or reject the bond. So we tried. He tried. I tried so hard to be what he needed, what he wanted. To prove I could be a proper mate despite my defect. You tried to change yourself, Kale said quietly, to fit into a shape that was never meant for you. I had to, Alara insisted, even as part of her recognized the truth in his words. It was my only chance. If Marcus rejected me, I'd be marked as unwanted, unmateable. I'd spend the rest of my life as a burden on a pack that already resented having to support me. So yes, I tried to be softer, quieter, more submissive. I tried to make my presence tolerable. The year with Marcus had been exhausting in ways she hadn't known were possible. Constantly monitoring her words, her tone, her expressions. Apologizing for things that weren't her fault. Accepting blame for his moods, his frustrations, his disappointment that fate had shackled him to someone so inadequate. He hated touching me, she said suddenly, the admission escaping before she could stop it. He said my scent was too weak, that being near me made his wolf uncomfortable. We were supposed to wait for the formal mating, but even just holding hands or, her voice cracked, humiliation flooding through her. He couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand me. Cale's hands clenched into fists, his jaw so tight she could see the muscle jumping. But he didn't speak, didn't interrupt, letting her purge the poison she'd been carrying. Tonight was supposed to be different, Alara continued, tears finally escaping despite her best efforts to hold them back. The mating ceremony, where bonds are formally accepted and sealed. I thought maybe, once we were officially mated, once the bond was complete, things would be better. He'd finally see something worth keeping in me. Or at least, he'd accept what the goddess had given him, and we could build something functional if not happy. She wiped at her face angrily, hating the weakness of crying in front of this powerful alpha who'd claimed her for reasons she still didn't understand. Instead, he made a spectacle of it. He rejected me in front of everyone, with words calculated to ensure no one would ever question his decision. Made sure everyone understood it wasn't just him, it was me. Fundamentally, irreparably me. The broken mate bond ached in her chest, a phantom pain that would probably fade eventually, but right now felt raw and fresh. Not because she loved Marcus, she wasn't even sure she'd liked him, honestly, but because his rejection had confirmed every terrible thing she'd ever believed about herself. And then I ran, she finished quietly. Like a coward. Like someone too weak to face the consequences of existing wrong. I ran into the forbidden forest and nearly got myself killed, and you. She looked at Cale finally, confusion and gratitude and lingering disbelief warring in her expression. You saved me. Even though you knew what I was. Even though everyone else would say I'm not worth the trouble. Cale moved then, crossing the space between them with fluid grace, settling beside her against the wall close enough that their shoulders touched. The contact sent warmth through her chilled body, made her wolf hum with contentment despite everything. I need you to hear something, Alara, he said, his voice low and intense, pitched for her ears alone. And I need you to really listen, not just dismiss it as kindness or pity or whatever protective mechanism you're using to guard yourself right now. She held her breath, waiting. Your wolf isn't broken, Cale continued, his silver eyes burning with conviction. She's bound. There's a difference. Someone locked her away, suppressed her, prevented her from emerging fully. And I think you know who did it. Alara's breath caught. That's not no one would. Your parents, Cale said flatly. Or the pack healers acting on someone's orders. Someone who saw what you were becoming and decided you needed to be controlled before you became too powerful to manage. The suggestion was insane, impossible, the kind of conspiracy theory that. Except there was that memory, hazy and distant, from when she was very young. Before the failed shifts, before the disappointment. A memory of her mother arguing with someone in hushed, urgent tones. Of words like dangerous and unstable and for her own good. I remember, Alara's voice came out hoarse. Something the healers did when I was 6. They said it was a standard examination, but my mother held me down while they pressed their hands to my chest and chanted something. I remember it hurt. Remember feeling like something was being ripped away from inside me. But afterward, everyone said I was just being dramatic, that it had been a simple blessing ceremony. Cale's expression turned murderous. They bound your wolf. Deliberately suppressed her development. And they made you believe it was your fault, that you were defective, so you'd never question why you couldn't shift properly. But why? The question came out desperate, pleading. Why would they do that? What could possibly be dangerous about a child's wolf? That, Kale said softly, is what we're going to find out. Because I don't think you're just any Omega, Alara. I think you're something much rarer. Something the old families feared enough to try to eliminate from the bloodlines. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above her collarbone, not quite touching. May I? Alara nodded, not sure what he was asking permission for, but trusting him in ways that should have terrified her. Kale's fingers pressed gently against her skin, right above her heart, and suddenly heat flooded through her, not painful, not burning, but warm and electric and right. His eyes closed, his expression one of deep concentration, and Alara felt her wolf surge forward, pressing against whatever invisible barrier had always held her back. There, Kale breathed. I can feel it. The binding. It's old, well-crafted, meant to last a lifetime. But it's not perfect. Whoever did this to you didn't account for the possibility that you'd meet someone strong enough to help you break it. His eyes opened, meeting hers, and the intensity there stole her breath. Your wolf isn't weak, Alara. She's been fighting this binding your entire life, trying to break free, exhausting herself in the attempt. That's why your shifts hurt so much, why they stop halfway. She's not broken, she's trapped. And furious about it. As if in response to his words, Alara felt her wolf push harder against the barrier, felt the binding strain and flex. Pain lanced through her chest, sharp and sudden, making her gasp. Kale's hand moved to cup her face, grounding her. Easy. Don't push too hard yet. Breaking a binding this old requires care, time. If we shatter it all at once, the backlash could hurt you permanently. We have to unpick it carefully layer by layer. You can do that? Hope, dangerous, terrifying hope, bloomed in her chest. You can free her? We can do that, Kale corrected. Together. Your wolf needs to remember how to trust, how to push against the binding without exhausting herself. And I need to identify exactly what kind of magic was used, so I know how to counter it safely. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, the gesture almost tender. It will take time. Probably weeks, maybe longer. But yes, Alara. I believe we can free your wolf and let you become who you were always meant to be. Tears streamed down her face now, unchecked, born from emotions too complex to name. Relief. Fear. Grief for the years stolen from her. Rage at the people who'd done this. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't fundamentally broken after all. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this for me? What do you gain from helping a rejected Omega break a binding her own pack wanted in place? Kale's smile was sad, knowing. Because the moon goddess showed me a vision of a wolf with fire in her veins. And I think, Alara Winters, that when your wolf is finally free, when she's allowed to claim her full power, that fire is going to change everything. Not just for you. For all of us. He leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. I think your pack bound you because they knew what you were. What you could become. And I think they were right to be afraid, just not for the reasons they told themselves. Alara's breath hitched. What am I? Something ancient, Kale said reverently. Something powerful. Something that was supposed to be extinct, bred out of the bloodlines generations ago because the old alphas feared losing control. His silver eyes burned with conviction. I think, Alara, that you're a flamebringer. And when your wolf breaks free, the entire realm is going to remember why our ancestors used to worship your kind. The word resonated through her like a bell, like recognition, like coming home. Flamebringer. She'd heard it once, maybe, in old stories her grandmother used to tell before she died. Stories of wolves who could call fire, who could hear the goddess's voice directly, who could see truth and lies with equal clarity. Stories everyone dismissed as myths, as fairy tales meant to entertain children. But looking into Kale's eyes, feeling her wolf's fierce agreement humming through every nerve, Alara wondered if maybe those stories had been warnings instead of entertainment. If maybe her pack had known exactly what they were binding when they'd held her down at 6 years old and locked her power away. If maybe the broken, rejected Omega everyone pitted was actually something they should have feared all along. I don't know how to be that, she admitted, vulnerability and wonder warring in her voice. I don't know how to be anything except what they made me. Then we'll figure it out together, Kale promised, his hand still cradling her face like she was something precious. Step by step, layer by layer, until your wolf is free and you can finally see yourself the way I see you. The way the goddess sees you. Outside, thunder rumbled, the storm finally beginning to break. But inside the ancient shelter, by the fire, Alara felt something shift in her chest, not the binding breaking, not yet, but the first hairline fracture in its surface. The first sign that maybe, impossibly, she could be free. And when she met Kale's silver eyes and saw nothing but certainty and promise reflected back, she let herself believe it. Dawn broke over the ancient ruins with reluctant light, pale and hesitant, as if the sun itself was uncertain about illuminating what had transpired in the darkness. Alara woke slowly, consciousness returning in fragments, the warmth of fire-heated stone against her back, the distant murmur of voices, the strange absence of fear that had been her constant companion for so long. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, why her body ached in unfamiliar places, why her chest felt simultaneously hollow and full. Then memory crashed through her like a wave. The ceremony. Marcus's rejection. The rogues. Kale. She opened her eyes to find him sitting near the entrance of the shelter, his back to her, speaking in low tones with the scarred female warrior from the night before. Morning light filtered through the broken roof, catching in his dark hair, outlining the powerful lines of his shoulders and back. Even motionless, he radiated authority, that bone-deep certainty of someone who'd never questioned his right to command. Alara sat up carefully, her borrowed clothes twisted around her from sleep, her body protesting the movement with a chorus of aches. The fire had burned down to embers, but residual warmth still clung to the ancient stones, making the space almost comfortable despite the chill morning air beyond their shelter. Kale turned at the sound of her movement, those silver eyes finding hers immediately, something flickering in their depths that might have been relief. "You're awake." It wasn't a question, but Alara nodded anyway, suddenly hyper-aware of how she must look. Hair tangled, eyes probably swollen from last night's tears, wearing his warrior's clothes like a child playing dress-up. She pushed her hair back from her face, trying for some semblance of dignity. How long was I asleep? A few hours. The storm broke just before dawn. Kale rose in one fluid movement, crossing to crouch beside her with that same careful consideration he'd shown last night, maintaining distance while making himself available. "Are you hungry? Thirsty?" As if in answer, her stomach growled audibly, and embarrassment flooded through her. When had she last eaten? Before the ceremony, maybe, though she'd been too nervous to manage more than a few bites. That felt like years ago now instead of just hours. The scarred warrior appeared with a water skin and something wrapped in cloth. She offered them to Alara without speaking, her expression neutral, but her eyes assessing, measuring, trying to determine what kind of wolf their alpha had claimed in the darkness. Alara took the offerings with shaking hands. "Thank you." The warrior nodded once, then retreated to join the others who'd reformed their perimeter around the clearing. Alara unwrapped the cloth to find dried meat and journey bread, simple food, but her mouth watered at the sight of it. She ate slowly, trying not to appear desperate even though hunger clawed at her stomach with unexpected ferocity. Kale watched her eat with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between satisfaction and concern. When she'd finished and drained half the water skin, he spoke again, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "There's something I need to show you. Something that might help you understand why I was so certain the goddess sent me visions of you specifically." He paused, choosing his words with obvious care. "But it requires trust. It requires you to follow me somewhere sacred, somewhere my warriors guard but cannot enter. Just the two of us." Alara's pulse quickened. Alone with him, in a sacred place, away from even the protection of his warriors. Everything logical screamed that this was dangerous, foolish, exactly the kind of mistake that got vulnerable wolves hurt or worse. But looking into those silver eyes, feeling her wolf's certainty humming through her veins, she found herself nodding before her brain could construct proper objections. Where? Kale's slight smile suggested he'd expected nothing less. Not far. Maybe 20 minutes deeper into the forest. There's a shrine there, older than any pack currently in these territories. Older than the conflicts that divided us into separate bloodlines. He stood, offering his hand. If your binding is what I suspect, if you truly are what I believe you to be, that place will recognize you. And you might finally get answers to questions you didn't even know how to ask. Elara placed her hand in his, letting him pull her to her feet. Her body protested the movement with renewed aches, but she ignored them, focused entirely on the strange mixture of anticipation and dread coiling in her stomach. Answers. After years of being told she was broken, defective, fundamentally wrong, the possibility of actual answers felt almost too large to comprehend. Kale led her from the shelter into morning light that felt shocking after the dimness inside. His warriors stood at attention as they passed, each one pressing fist to heart in a gesture of respect that seemed directed as much at her as their alpha. Recognition of her new status in their strange, unconventional pack. They moved into the forest, following paths that weren't quite paths, spaces between trees that seemed deliberately maintained even though no one should have been here to maintain them. The deeper they went, the older the forest became, trees with trunks so wide 3 people couldn't have circled them, moss growing thick and vibrant green, undergrowth that looked almost cultivated in its arrangement. This place, Kale said quietly, not breaking stride, was once a gathering ground for all packs in the region. Before the Great Fracturing, before Alpha's decided territory was more important than unity. Wolves came here to settle disputes, celebrate victories, mourn losses. The goddess was believed to walk these paths during full moons, offering guidance to those who sought it. Elara felt something shift in the air around them, a weight that pressed against her skin without actually touching. Power. Ancient and patient and watching. Her wolf stirred, pressing forward with interest rather than fear, like she recognized this place even though Elara's human mind had no memory of ever being here. What happened? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, reluctant to disturb whatever presence lingered in these woods. Why did everyone stop coming? Kale's jaw tightened, old anger flickering across his features. Politics. Fear. The rise of alpha families who decided might made right, who couldn't tolerate the idea that the goddess might favor wolves outside their bloodlines. They declared the old gathering grounds forbidden, claimed they'd been corrupted by dark magic or rogue influences. In reality, they just couldn't stand the thought that an Omega or a low-ranked wolf might have as much right to divine guidance as they did. The bitterness in his voice spoke of personal experience, of wounds that went deeper than simple philosophical disagreement. Elara wondered what had driven this powerful alpha to reject pack structure so completely, to build his own family from society's outcasts. But before she could ask, they emerged into another clearing, and all questions fled from her mind. The shrine rose before them like something from a fever dream, simultaneously crumbling and majestic. Stone pillars carved with symbols she didn't recognize supported nothing. Whatever roof they'd once held had collapsed centuries ago. But between the pillars, the air shimmered with that same weight she'd felt building in the forest, only magnified 100-fold. At the center stood an altar of black stone, its surface polished smooth by countless hands, countless offerings, countless prayers. And carved into that altar, so deep the grooves seemed to reach down to the earth's core, was a symbol that made Elara's breath catch and her wolf surge forward with recognition, so intense it was almost painful. Flames. Rising from cupped hands. Reaching toward a crescent moon. The mark of the Flamebringers, Kale said softly, watching her face rather than the shrine. The wolves who could hear the goddess's voice directly, who could call fire without burning, who could see truth cut through any lie or illusion. They were the bridge between mortal wolves and the divine, revered and feared in equal measure. Alara couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at that symbol that felt carved into her bones, into her very soul. She'd seen it before. Not in books or stories, but somewhere deeper. In dreams, maybe, or in that hazy space between waking and sleeping where memory and imagination blurred together. They were hunted, Kale continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting history learned and memorized. Not openly, not officially. But the Alpha families began arranging matches, controlling bloodlines, ensuring Flamebringer traits were diluted generation after generation. And when dilution wasn't enough, when a child showed signs of awakening that ancient power, he trailed off, but Alara understood what he wasn't saying. They were bound. Like her. Crippled before they could become what they were meant to be. How many? The question emerged hoarse, strained. How many of us are there? No one knows. The families who practiced binding kept no records. Doing so would have been admission of crimes they denied committing. But I've been searching for years, following rumors and old bloodlines, looking for any sign that Flamebringer power still existed somewhere in the realm. His silver eyes burned with intensity. And 3 months ago, the goddess answered that search with a vision of you. Alara took a step toward the altar, then another, drawn by something she couldn't name. Her wolf was practically vibrating with eagerness now, straining against the binding that had held her captive for so long. The air around the shrine grew warmer as she approached, or maybe that was just her imagination, her desperate need to believe she was something more than broken. I don't feel powerful, she whispered, stopping at the altar's edge, her fingers hovering above the carved flames without quite touching. I feel hollow. Like there's a shape inside me where something important should be, but it's just empty space. That's the binding, Kale said, moving to stand beside her, his presence warm and solid and grounding. It doesn't remove your power, it can't, any more than cutting away your shadow would stop you from casting one. But it locks it away, makes it inaccessible, forces it to turn inward and consume itself rather than manifesting outward. He reached out, his hand covering hers, his fingers curling around her palm to press her hand flat against the carved symbol. The stone was warm beneath her touch, warmer than morning sun on rock should have been, almost alive with residual heat. Feel that? Kale's voice dropped lower, more intimate. Your power recognizes this place. Recognizes what it represents. The binding can't completely suppress that recognition because it's older than any magic wolves can work. It's divine. Given by the goddess herself to wolves she deemed worthy of carrying her flame. Heat built beneath Alara's palm, spreading up her arm, into her chest where the binding sat like a cage around her wolf. For a moment, just a heartbeat, just a breath, she felt something shift. Felt the bars of that cage flex and strain. Felt her wolf push against them with renewed strength, howling with rage and triumph and desperate, aching need. Then pain lanced through her, sharp and sudden, driving her to her knees. The binding snapped back into place with vicious force, punishing her for daring to challenge it, reminding her why she'd learned to keep her wolf suppressed and silent. Kale caught her before she hit the ground, his arms coming around her, cradling her against his chest. Easy, easy, I've got you. His hand pressed against her back, right between her shoulder blades, and warmth flooded through her again, different from the altar's heat, more controlled, deliberate. Soothing rather than awakening. What was that? Alara gasped, her hands clutching at his shoulders, her entire body trembling with aftershocks of pain and power and possibility. Your wolf testing the binding's limits, Kale said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, not at her, she realized, but at whoever had done this to her in the first place. This place amplifies divine power, makes it easier for Flamebringers to connect with their gifts. Your wolf felt that and tried to break free all at once. But the binding is too strong, too well-crafted. We can't shatter it with brute force. We have to unpick it carefully, or the backlash could destroy you both. He helped her stand, keeping one arm around her waist for support, his other hand still pressed against her back. But did you feel it? That moment before the pain, when your power responded to the shrine. Alara nodded, still shaking, still processing the intensity of what had just happened. Because yes, she'd felt it. Felt something vast and ancient stir inside her, felt potential she'd never imagined blazing to life for one perfect, terrifying instant. Felt whole. That's what they feared, Kale said softly, his breath warm against her ear. That moment when you remember what you are. When you connect with power that doesn't require their permission, their approval, their carefully maintained hierarchy. You're dangerous to them, Alara, not because you're broken, but because you never were. You're exactly what you were always meant to be, and that terrifies every alpha who's built their authority on suppressing wolves like you. The words settled into her bones, into the hollow spaces the binding had created, filling them with something that felt almost like purpose. Like direction. Like the first step on a path she hadn't known existed until now. How do we break it? She asked, her voice steadier now despite her trembling body. The binding. How do we unpick it without killing me in the process? Kale's expression shifted, becoming more serious, more focused. Time. Patience. And trust. Your wolf needs to learn she can push against the binding without triggering the pain response. She needs to build strength gradually, like exercising a muscle that's been immobilized for years. And I need to study the binding structure, understand exactly what magic was used and where its weak points are. He guided her to sit on the step leading up to the altar, then knelt in front of her, his hands resting lightly on her knees, close enough to be grounding, but not constraining. Every day, we'll come here or to places like it. You'll practice connecting with your power in small increments, just enough to strain the binding without triggering the backlash. And every night, I'll examine the binding structure, looking for the threads I can start carefully cutting without causing damage. How long? The question came out more desperate than she'd intended. How long would she have to wait to feel whole? To know what it was like to shift properly, to connect with her wolf without pain, to access whatever power the goddess had supposedly given her bloodline? I don't know, Kale admitted, and his honesty meant more than false reassurance would have. Weeks, probably. Maybe months. Bindings this sophisticated were designed to last lifetimes. Breaking one safely isn't something that happens overnight. Months. Months of careful practice, of incremental progress, of living in this strange limbo between what she'd always been and what she might become. The prospect should have been exhausting, should have filled her with despair at the road ahead. Instead, sitting in this ancient shrine with Kale's hands warm on her knees and her wolf humming with newfound hope, Alara felt something unexpected bloom in her chest. Determination. Then we start now, she said, meeting his silver eyes with conviction she'd never felt before. Today. Right now. I've spent my entire life accepting what everyone told me I was. I'm done being passive. Done letting fear or pain or their fucking binding decide what I'm capable of. Kale's smile transformed his face, fierce and proud and approving in ways that made heat flood through her for reasons that had nothing to do with divine power. There she is, he said softly. There's the wolf the goddess showed me. The one with fire in her veins. He stood, pulling her up with him, his hands sliding from her knees to her hands, fingers intertwining with hers. The first step is learning to sense the binding itself. Right now, you only feel it when it activates, when it punishes you for pushing too hard. But it's always there, always working, always suppressing. You need to become aware of its presence even in rest. Alara nodded, focusing inward, trying to feel whatever invisible cage lived inside her chest. But there was nothing except the familiar hollow sensation, the absence where her wolf should have been fully present. Close your eyes, Kale instructed, his voice taking on that commanding quality that made her wolf sit up and pay attention. Focus on your breathing. In and out. Slow and steady. Let everything else fade away, the shrine, the forest, even me. Just your breath and your heartbeat. She obeyed, letting her eyes drift closed, surrendering to the rhythm of her own body. In, out, in, out. Her heartbeat was too fast at first, still elevated from the pain and shock of moments ago, but gradually it steadied, finding its natural pace. Now, Kale continued, his voice seeming to come from very far away and simultaneously from right inside her head, call to your wolf. Not aggressively, not trying to force a shift. Just reach for her. The way you might reach for someone's hand in the dark. Alara did, sending her consciousness down into that space where her wolf lived, that place inside herself she'd learned to avoid because it always hurt, always disappointed. But this time, guided by Kale's voice and the shrine's residual power, she moved slowly, carefully, like approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at sudden movement. Her wolf was there, waiting. Not retreating as she sometimes did, but pressed up against something Alara couldn't quite see, like watching someone push against glass, seeing their silhouette but not the barrier itself. I can feel her, Alara breathed, afraid to speak louder, afraid to break the concentration. She's there, but there's something between us. Something I can't quite. The binding, Kale said. You're sensing its presence for the first time. Now try to trace it. Follow its edges. Don't push against it yet. Just observe. Learn its shape. This was harder. The binding didn't have clearly defined edges, didn't present as something solid she could trace with mental fingers. Instead, it was more like a pressure, a weight that surrounded her wolf on all sides, compressing her, limiting her, forcing her into a space too small for what she was meant to be. And the more Alara focused on it, the more she realized how extensive it was. This wasn't a simple lock someone had placed on her wolf's cage. This was architectural, woven through every part of her connection to her animal, restricting not just her ability to shift, but something deeper. Something fundamental to what being a wolf meant. Rage blazed through her, hot and sudden. Someone had done this to her. Had looked at a child and decided she needed to be crippled, needed to be trapped, needed to be made less than what she was meant to be. And they'd done it so thoroughly, so carefully, with such precise cruelty that it had taken years for anyone, even her, to understand it wasn't natural defect, but deliberate mutilation. The binding flexed in response to her anger, tightening, and pain lanced through her chest. Alara gasped, her eyes flying open, her hands clenching around Kale's with enough force that her knuckles went white. Too much emotion, Kale said quickly, his own hands squeezing hers back, grounding her. The binding responds to strong feeling, anger, fear, grief. It uses your own emotions against you, tightening when you feel too intensely. That's part of its design, part of what makes it so effective at suppression. So I have to be calm? Bitterness leaked into her voice. While examining the thing that's been torturing me my entire life, I have to maintain perfect emotional neutrality. Not neutrality, Kale corrected, his voice gentling. Acceptance. You need to acknowledge the binding's presence without fighting it. Observe it the way you might observe weather, noting that it's raining without raging at the sky for producing rain. That's impossible. It's difficult, Kale agreed. But not impossible. And you don't have to master it today or tomorrow or even next week. This is why I said it would take time. You're learning to interact with something that was specifically designed to punish interaction. He released one of her hands to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone in a gesture that was becoming familiar, comforting. But you felt it, Alara. You sensed the binding for the first time. That's progress. That's the first step toward eventually breaking it. First step. Out of how many? Hundreds? Thousands? The path ahead suddenly seemed insurmountable, stretching away into an indefinite future of careful practice and incremental progress, while the binding continued to suppress everything she was meant to be. As if reading her thoughts, Kale's expression softened. I know it seems overwhelming. I know you want it gone now, want to be free now, want to finally understand what your power feels like without restriction. But rushing this process won't help either of us. The binding will win if we try to force it. Our only chance is patience. I'm not good at patience, Alara admitted, leaning almost unconsciously into his touch, seeking comfort from his solidity, his certainty. I've spent my entire life waiting for things to get better, to improve, to somehow magically fix themselves. Patience just feels like another word for giving up. Then we'll redefine it, Kale said firmly. Patience isn't passive waiting, it's active preparation. Every day you practice sensing the binding, you're preparing for the moment we can finally break it. Every night I study its structure, I'm building the knowledge we need to dismantle it safely. We're not waiting, Alara. We're working. There's a difference. The distinction settled something inside her, transformed the overwhelming prospect of months of careful practice into something that felt more like purpose. More like action rather than passive suffering. Okay, she said quietly. Okay. We work. We prepare. We take it one step at a time. She met his silver eyes, saw her own determination reflected back at her. But when we finally break this thing, when my wolf is finally free, I'm going to find whoever did this to me. And they're going to answer for it. Kale's smile was sharp, predatory, approving. When that day comes, I'll hold them down while you make them explain exactly what they thought they were accomplishing. And then, his expression darkened, promising violence. Then I'll make sure they understand what happens to wolves who bind children. The vow should have disturbed her, should have made her question what kind of alpha she'd bound herself to. Instead, it made her wolf rumble with satisfaction, with the bone-deep knowledge that this male, this strange, powerful, mysterious alpha who'd appeared exactly when she needed him most, would go to war for her if necessary, would burn down the world if that's what justice required. They stood together in the ancient shrine, morning light filtering through broken pillars, the carved flames on the altar seeming to pulse with their own inner heat. And in that moment, Alara felt the first stirrings of something she'd never experienced before in Crescent Shadow, never even imagined was possible. She felt like she belonged somewhere. Not because of her designation, not despite her supposed defect, but because of who she was underneath everything. The rage and resilience and stubborn refusal to break even when breaking would have been easier. Kale had looked at all that mess, all that damage, all that carefully suppressed fury at the injustice of her existence, and he'd claimed it. Claimed her. Not to fix her or save her or make her into something more palatable, but because he recognized in her something worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth the considerable effort it would take to help her become fully herself. What happens now? She asked softly, reluctant to break the moment, but needing to understand what came next, where they went from here. Your warriors said the border patrol was looking for me. My pack won't just let this go. Kale's jaw tightened, and she saw strategy flash behind his eyes, calculations being made about threats and resources, and how to keep her safe, while they worked to break her binding. Now we make it clear that you're under my protection. That anyone who wants to take you will have to go through me, and every warrior who's sworn themselves to my cause. He paused, considering. And we start building the evidence we need to prove what was done to you. Because when your binding finally breaks, when your power manifests, the packs are going to have questions. We need to be ready with answers that shift blame where it belongs on those who performed the binding, not on you for finally breaking free of it. It was practical, strategic, the kind of thinking Alara had never been particularly good at. She'd spent her life reacting to circumstances rather than planning for them, accepting what was done to her rather than considering how to prevent future harm. The idea that someone was thinking 3 moves ahead on her behalf, planning not just for her immediate safety, but for her future vindication, made emotions swell in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for everything she was feeling, but the only ones she could manage without crying. "For this. For believing me. For being so certain when I couldn't be." Kale's expression gentled, and he pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like protection and promise and something deeper she wasn't quite ready to name. His chin rested on top of her head, and she could feel his heartbeat, steady, strong, sure. "The goddess led me to you for a reason," he said quietly. "I don't claim to understand all her plans, don't pretend to know why she chose to weave our paths together. But I know this, you were never meant to be broken, Alara Winters. You were meant to burn. And I'm going to make sure you finally get the chance." Standing in his arms, in this sacred place where ancient power still hummed in the stones and air, Alara let herself believe him. Let herself imagine a future where her wolf ran free, where power flowed through her without restriction, where she finally understood what the goddess had intended when she'd placed Flamebringer blood in her veins. Let herself hope that maybe, impossibly, the rejected Omega everyone pitted might actually be something worth fearing instead. And in the depths of her chest, pressed up against the binding that had caged her for so long, her wolf lifted her head and howled. Not in pain, not in despair, but in anticipation of the freedom that was finally, impossibly, within reach. The kiss shattered when a howl tore through the night, not the ceremonial howls of pack wolves celebrating under the full moon, but something darker, edged with challenge and threat. Kale jerked back from Alara, his entire body going rigid, his silver eyes flashing with fury and something that looked almost like fear. "They found us," he said, his voice barely human, more growl than words. He was on his feet in an instant, and Alara watched in stunned fascination as his warriors materialized from the darkness, forming a protective circle around the clearing with military precision. The scarred female warrior, Alara had learned her name was Vera, appeared at Kale's side, her expression grim. 3 packs, converging from different directions. Crescent Shadow leads, but Ironwood and Silver Peak forces are with them. They're calling it a coalition. A coalition, Kale repeated, and bitter laughter escaped him. How convenient that they can unite when it serves their interests, but peaceful coexistence during my time was apparently impossible. Alara scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs, that brief moment of connection with Kale already feeling like a dream. Reality had crashed back with vicious efficiency, reminding her that she couldn't hide in ancient shrines forever, that the world she'd fled would eventually come looking. "How many?" Kale asked, his hands already moving to check weapons she hadn't noticed him carrying. 30, maybe 40 warriors. They're not trying to hide their approach. Vera's jaw tightened. They brought trackers. And Marcus Thorne is leading the Crescent Shadow contingent. The name hit Alara like a physical blow, made something in her chest twist with humiliation and residual pain. Marcus. The male who'd rejected her so publicly, so cruelly. He was coming for her, probably to drag her back to Crescent Shadow and face whatever punishment the pack had decided she deserved for running. Kale turned to her, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. Protective fury blazed in his eyes, along with something that looked almost like possession. "You don't have to face them. Say the word, and we disappear. I know places even their best trackers couldn't find." It was tempting. So tempting to let him spirit her away, to hide from the confrontation bearing down on them. But something in Alara rebelled at the idea. She'd spent her entire life running from conflict, accepting judgment, letting others define her worth. The thought of continuing that pattern, even with Kale's protection, made her wolf snarl with unexpected defiance. "No," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "No more running. If they want to find me, let them. Let them see that I'm not the broken thing they thought they'd discarded." Kale's smile was fierce, proud, devastating. "There she is. There's the wolf I saw in my vision." He moved closer, his hand coming up to cup her face one more time. "But understand this, if they try to take you, if they try to hurt you, there will be blood. I won't stand by and watch them tear you apart." "I know," Alara said, and she did. Could see the promise of violence in every line of his body, could sense his wolf straining just beneath his skin, ready to protect what he'd claimed as his. "But let me talk to them first. Let me face Marcus and my pack and tell them exactly what I think of their judgment." Before Kale could respond, the forest around them seemed to hold its breath, that moment of absolute silence before the storm breaks. And then wolves emerged from the trees, dozens of them, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight, their forms radiating coordinated menace. Alara recognized many of them. Crescent Shadow warriors she'd grown up around, wolves who'd watched her fail repeatedly, who'd whispered about her defect, who'd probably celebrated when Marcus rejected her. And among them, stepping to the forefront with an expression of righteous anger, was Marcus himself. He was in human form, dressed in ceremonial armor that marked him as a ranked pack member, his dark hair pulled back from a face she'd once thought handsome. Now, looking at him with 3 days of distance and Kale's acceptance still warming her skin, she saw him clearly for the first time. Saw the weakness masquerading as strength, the insecurity hiding behind arrogance, the smallness of a male who could only feel big by making others feel small. "Alara Winters," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the weight of pack authority he didn't quite have the power to back up. "You are called to answer for your crimes against Crescent Shadow. Abandonment of pack during ceremony. Theft of pack resources. Consorting with rogues and outlaws." The charges were absurd, clearly fabricated to justify whatever they'd come here to do. But Alara noted the wolves flanking Marcus. Not just Crescent Shadow, but representatives from other packs, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed contempt. They were here to witness, to judge, to ensure whatever happened next was sanctioned by coalition agreement. "Crimes," Alara repeated, and she was shocked by how calm her voice sounded, how steady. "Is it a crime to flee after being publicly humiliated? Is it theft to survive after being cast out? Or is this just your way of controlling the narrative, Marcus? Making sure everyone knows the rejected Omega is the problem, not the system that broke her." Murmurs rippled through the assembled wolves, and she saw some expressions shift, surprise, maybe, or uncertainty. They hadn't expected her to speak, to challenge, to stand her ground. Marcus's jaw tightened, anger flashing across his features. "You were given everything. A home, a designation, a mate bond blessed by the goddess herself. And you squandered it all because you're too defective to appreciate what you had. A mate bond you rejected," Alara shot back, her voice rising with fury she'd kept buried for too long. "In front of everyone, with words calculated to ensure I could never hold my head up and pack again. Don't pretend you're the victim here, Marcus. Don't pretend your cruelty was somehow justified." "Cruelty?" Marcus laughed, and the sound made her skin crawl. "I spoke truth. You can barely shift. Your scent is so weak even your own wolf doesn't want you. Binding myself to someone so fundamentally broken would have weakened my entire bloodline. I did what any responsible wolf would do, I protected my future." The words should have hurt. A week ago, they would have driven her to her knees, would have confirmed every terrible thing she believed about herself. But standing here, with Kale's presence solid at her back and her wolf pressing against the binding with new strength, they just made her angry. "Broken," she said softly, dangerously. "You keep using that word. But I'm starting to think you don't actually know what it means." She took a step forward, and satisfaction flooded through her when several of the assembled wolves actually stepped back. "I was 6 years old when my pack bound my wolf. Held me down and performed magic specifically designed to suppress my power, to lock away abilities that frightened them. And they made me believe it was my fault. That I was defective. That I deserved the pain and limitation they deliberately inflicted." More murmurs, louder this time. She saw shock on some faces, denial on others. But also, and this made her breath catch, recognition. Wolves who looked like they might be remembering their own suspicions, their own observations of a child who'd been too powerful too young. "That's a lie," Marcus snarled, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Your parents would never." "My parents did exactly what they were told to do by pack elders who feared what I might become," Alara interrupted, each word feeling like liberation, like finally speaking truth she'd carried silently for years. "They bound a flamebringer because they couldn't control me any other way. And then they spent the next 15 years making me feel worthless for struggling against restrictions they'd placed on me." The word flamebringer rippled through the assembled wolves like electricity. Ancient power, thought extinct, relegated to stories meant to frighten children. Alara watched understanding dawn on multiple faces, watched fear replace contempt, watched the entire dynamic shift as wolves reconsidered everything they thought they knew about the rejected Omega. An older male stepped forward from the Silver Peak contingent, an alpha, judging by the authority rolling off him in waves. His gray-streaked hair and scarred face spoke of age and experience, and when he spoke, his voice carried weight that made even Marcus fall silent. If what you claim is true, the Alpha said carefully, if you truly are a bound Flamebringer, then you represent a threat to pack stability throughout the realm. Our ancestors bred that power out of the bloodlines for good reason. Flamebringers couldn't be controlled, couldn't be managed. They answered only to the goddess, and their power was too dangerous to be trusted in the hands of wolves who might use it to upset the natural order. Natural order, Kale spoke for the first time, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. He moved to stand beside Alara, his presence radiating protective menace. You mean the hierarchy that keeps you comfortable and powerful while crushing anyone who threatens your authority. That's what you're really protecting, Alpha Theron. Not stability. Not safety. Your own position. The old Alpha's eyes narrowed as he studied Kale, and recognition flickered across his features. Kale Shadowborn. I should have known you'd be involved in this. You've been gathering outcasts and rogues for years, spreading sedition, undermining pack authority. And now you've found yourself a Flamebringer to use as a weapon against us. I found myself a wolf who was systematically abused by the very system you uphold, Kale corrected, his voice deadly soft. A female who deserves the chance to discover what she was meant to be before your fear decided otherwise. And yes, if that threatens your precious hierarchy, I consider it a bonus. Tension crackled through the clearing, and Alara could feel violence gathering like a storm about to break. Warriors on both sides were shifting, hands moving to weapons, wolves pressing closer to their skin in anticipation of transformation. This was about to turn bloody, and she would be the excuse for it, the spark that ignited conflict that had been building for years. Enough. Another voice, female, carried authority that made everyone pause. A woman emerged from the Ironwood contingent, her silver hair gleaming in the moonlight, her bearing suggesting power that transcended physical strength. This is not a decision for warriors to make with teeth and claws. If the girl claims to be a bound Flamebringer, there are ways to verify such things. The old rituals still exist. Elder Maris, Alpha Theron said, and there was respect in his tone that suggested this woman outranked even him in the complex web of pack politics. You would have us perform the revelation? That ritual hasn't been used in generations. Then it's past time we remembered how, Elder Maris said calmly. She turned her gaze to Alara, and those ancient eyes seemed to see straight through skin and bone to whatever truth lived in her core. Child, if you truly are what you claim, the revelation will prove it beyond doubt. Your binding will be made visible to all, and your bloodline will declare itself. But be warned, the ritual is painful, and it cannot be stopped once begun. Are you willing to submit to such a test? Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. A ritual to prove what she was, to make the binding visible, to potentially vindicate everything Kale had told her, it was exactly what she needed. But the elder's warning about pain made her wolf whimper with apprehension. She'd experienced enough pain for a lifetime, enough agony during her failed shifts to make the prospect of deliberate suffering almost unbearable. Kale's hand found hers, squeezed gently. You don't have to do this. We can leave, find another way to prove the truth. But Alara shook her head. Because if she ran now, if she refused the test, she'd spend the rest of her life wondering. Wondering if Kale was right, if she truly was something more than broken. Wondering if she'd given up her one chance to know, definitively, what she was meant to be. I'll do it, she said, her voice steady despite her fear. Whatever this ritual requires, I'll submit to it. Let them see the binding. Let them understand what was done to me. Elder Maris's expression softened almost imperceptibly. You have courage, child. More than those who bound you gave you credit for. She turned to address the assembled wolves. We will perform the revelation here, under the full moon, with all three packs bearing witness. Kale Shadowborn and his warriors will maintain their position, but any interference during the ritual will be considered an act of war. Are we agreed? Alpha Theron looked like he wanted to argue, but after a moment he nodded grudgingly. Marcus remained silent, his expression dark with emotions Alara couldn't fully read. Rage, maybe, or fear that he'd rejected something far more valuable than he'd understood. Kale pulled Alara close, his mouth near her ear. The moment this goes wrong, the moment you're in real danger, I'm ending it. Coalition be damned. She nodded, drawing strength from his presence, from the absolute certainty that he would protect her no matter the cost. Then she stepped forward, moving toward the center of the clearing where Elder Maris waited, and prepared to have every hidden truth dragged into the light. The Coalition had provided them a location, not the sacred ruins where Alara had first felt her power stir, but something almost as ancient. A stone lodge built into the mountainside, halfway between packed territories, surrounded by forest so dense it felt like stepping into another world. The building was old, constructed from stones that predated current pack conflicts, its walls thick enough to muffle sound, its rooms sparse but functional. It had been used for treaty negotiations once, back when packs still believed in peaceful resolution. Now it would serve as Alara's prison and potential salvation, the place where her binding would either break or where she would fail and face execution. Coalition representatives had stationed themselves around the perimeter. 3 wolves from each pack, rotating shifts, their presence a constant reminder that Alara was being watched, judged, measured against standards she still didn't fully understand. Kale's warriors maintained positions between the Coalition wolves and the lodge itself, creating a buffer zone that reduced direct confrontation but couldn't eliminate the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Inside the lodge, away from watching eyes, Alara stood at the window of the main room, staring out at forest she wasn't permitted to enter freely. Her binding still glowed faintly on her skin, visible now, thanks to the revelation ritual, a constant reminder of everything that had been done to her. The silver lines formed intricate patterns across her chest, down her arms, circling her throat like a collar. Beautiful in their complexity, horrifying in their purpose. She traced one of the lines with her finger, feeling the slight resistance where magic met flesh, the way her power pressed against it from the inside like a caged animal testing the strength of its bars. 28 days. That's how long they had to break this thing, to free her wolf, to prove she could wield Flamebringer power without becoming the threat everyone feared. 28 days that suddenly felt impossibly short. Behind her, she heard Kale enter the room. His footsteps deliberately heavy so she'd know he was approaching, never sneaking up on her, always giving her space to prepare for his presence. He'd been careful with her since the revelation, treating her like something fragile that might shatter if handled too roughly. It was consideration she appreciated even as it frustrated her. She didn't want to be fragile. Didn't want to be handled carefully. She wanted to be strong enough that carefulness was unnecessary. "You should eat something," Kale said quietly, setting a tray on the rough wooden table that dominated the room's center. Vera brought supplies from the nearest settlement. Real food, not just journey rations. Alara turned from the window, studying him in the firelight. He'd removed his mask. The Coalition representatives had demanded it, wanted to know exactly who was working with her, though they'd been visibly unsettled when they saw his face. Kale Shadowborn wasn't just any rogue alpha. He was the exiled son of the Nightshade Pack's former alpha, cast out 15 years ago for reasons that varied depending on who told the story. Some said he'd challenged his father's authority. Others claimed he'd committed crimes too severe to forgive. And a few whispered that he'd seen something he shouldn't have, learned truths the old families wanted buried, and paid for that knowledge with exile. Looking at him now, at the scars marking his face and the way shadows seemed to gather in the hollows beneath his cheekbones, Alara wondered which story was true. Wondered what had driven this powerful male to reject everything Pack Society offered in favor of building his own family from outcasts and rogues. "I'm not hungry," she said, though her stomach betrayed her with a low growl. She'd barely eaten since the Coalition's ultimatum, too anxious to manage more than a few bites at a time. Kale's expression suggested he knew she was lying but wouldn't push. Instead, he moved to the fire, adding wood with practiced efficiency, the flames growing brighter, casting warmth into corners the mountain cold had claimed. "The Coalition representatives are getting restless. They're questioning why we haven't started working on the binding yet." "Because we've been here less than a day," Alara said, frustration bleeding into her voice. "Because rushing this is exactly what they want. For us to make mistakes, for the binding to snap back and hurt me, for them to have an excuse to declare me too dangerous and execute me anyway. I know. Kale turned to face her fully, his silver eyes catching firelight and reflecting it back like mirrors. But they won't wait forever. Tomorrow, we begin. I'll start mapping the binding structure in detail, identifying which threads I can cut safely and which need more time. And you'll start practicing what we worked on at the shrine. Sensing the binding without triggering its defenses. Tomorrow. The word hung heavy between them, weighted with everything it represented. Once they began, there would be no going back. Every cut Kale made in the binding would weaken its overall structure, making it more volatile, more likely to snap if she pushed too hard. And every session of practice would bring her closer to the moment when her power finally broke free, whether she was ready for it or not. Alara moved away from the window, her bare feet silent on stone floor worn smooth by centuries of use. The coalition had allowed her to keep Kale's borrowed clothes, the oversized tunic and pants that hung loose on her frame, but had confiscated anything that might be considered a weapon. Not that she knew how to use weapons anyway. Her entire life had been spent learning to make herself small, harmless, non-threatening. The opposite of everything a warrior needed. She circled the table where Kale had set the food, eyeing it without really seeing it. Her mind was elsewhere, caught in the tangled mess of fear and anticipation that had become her constant companion. What if I can't do it? The question escaped before she could stop it. Vulnerability laid bare. What if we break the binding and my power is too much? What if everyone was right to fear what I might become? Kale was beside her in an instant, his movements so fluid and quiet she hadn't heard him cross the room. His hand came up to cup her face, gentle despite the calluses marking his palm, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone in a gesture that was becoming familiar, grounding. Then I'll be there to help you control it, he said, his voice pitched low, intimate, meant only for her. That's what this is about, Alara, not just breaking the binding, but teaching you to wield what's underneath. You won't be alone in this. You'll never be alone in this. The promise should have been impossible to believe. She barely knew him. A week ago, she hadn't even known he existed. Everything logical screamed that trusting this male was foolish, that depending on him would only lead to more heartbreak when he inevitably decided she was too much trouble, too broken, too dangerous to keep around. But looking into those silver eyes, feeling the certainty radiating from him in waves, Alara found herself believing anyway. Found herself leaning into his touch, accepting the comfort he offered, letting herself imagine a future where she wasn't defined by other people's fear. How do you know? She whispered. How are you so certain when I can't be? What makes you think I'm worth all this effort, all this risk? Kale's expression shifted, something raw and vulnerable flickering across his features before he could hide it. Because I was where you were once. Bound by expectations and fear, told I was too dangerous to be allowed freedom, that my power needed to be controlled for everyone's safety. And when I finally broke free, when I claimed my true strength, it wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't the destruction they'd feared, but something else entirely. He dropped his hand from her face, but didn't step back, maintaining that intimate distance that made her hyper-aware of his presence, of the heat radiating from his body, of the way her wolf pressed forward with interest that had nothing to do with the binding and everything to do with the male standing so close. I see myself in you, Kale continued, his voice rough with old wounds that hadn't fully healed. The rage at being caged. The shame of believing you deserved it. The fear that maybe everyone was right, maybe you are too dangerous, maybe the world is better off with you suppressed and silent. His jaw tightened. I spent years thinking that way. Years accepting their judgment, their restrictions, their careful management of what I was allowed to be. And it nearly destroyed me. Alara's breath caught. This was more than he'd revealed before, more than simple explanations about why he collected outcasts or challenged pack authority. This was personal, painful, the kind of truth that cost something to share. What changed? She asked, needing to understand what had transformed this male from someone bound by others' expectations into the powerful alpha who'd claimed her in defiance of 3 coalitions. Kale's smile was bitter, sharp-edged with memory. I met someone who refused to fear me, who looked at everything I'd been taught to suppress and said, "That's not a curse, that's a gift." His expression softened slightly. She was a healer from a pack that had exiled her for seeing too much, for speaking truths no one wanted to hear. And she taught me that power isn't inherently dangerous, it's how you use it, who you use it for, whether you let fear or purpose drive your choices. What happened to her? Ilara asked quietly, though part of her already knew the answer from the grief shadowing Kale's eyes. She died defending wolves who'd called her a threat. Poured everything she had into healing warriors wounded in a border conflict, burned herself out completely because she refused to choose who deserved salvation. His voice went rough, tight with old pain. She taught me that strength means protecting the vulnerable even when it costs everything. That true power is measured not by what you can destroy, but by what you're willing to sacrifice to build something better. The story settled into Ilara's bones, into the hollow spaces where doubt had lived for so long. Kale wasn't just offering her protection or claiming her for some mysterious purpose. He was trying to give her what someone had once given him, the chance to see herself as something other than a threat, the opportunity to define her own power rather than letting fear define it for her. "I'm sorry you lost her," Ilara said softly, meaning it, feeling the echo of his grief like it was her own. "So am I." Kale's hand found hers, fingers intertwining with practiced ease, like they'd done this 1,000 times instead of just a few. "But she taught me something I can now teach you, that being powerful doesn't mean being dangerous. That the wolves who fear your strength are often the ones who've used their own power to crush others. And that sometimes, the kindest thing you can do is become strong enough that you can't be silenced." The words resonated through Ilara like a bell, like recognition, like coming home. This was what she'd needed to hear, not that her power was acceptable, not that she could be tolerated if she behaved correctly, but that strength itself was valuable. That becoming more rather than less was the goal. That the fire in her veins wasn't something to apologize for but something to claim, to wield, to use in service of something larger than herself. She squeezed his hand, drawing courage from his certainty, from the way he looked at her like she was already the powerful thing she hoped to become. "Tell me about the binding," she said, needing to focus on something concrete, something actionable. "How does it work? Why does it hurt when I try to connect with my wolf?" Kale guided her to sit at the table, finally, and pushed the food toward her with a look that suggested she'd better eat something before he said anything else. Ilara picked up a piece of bread, tearing it into smaller pieces more for something to do with her hands than from any real appetite. "The binding works on multiple levels," Kale began, settling into the chair across from her, his expression shifting into something more clinical, more focused. "The visible part, the silver lines on your skin, that's just the surface manifestation. The real work happens deeper, in the space where your consciousness connects with your wolf's. Think of it like a net woven through that connection, each thread restricting a different aspect of your power." He reached across the table, his finger hovering just above one of the silver lines on her forearm. "This thread here, it suppresses your ability to shift fully. It allows partial transformations because completely blocking the shift would have been obvious, would have raised questions. But it stops you halfway, makes the process painful, ensures you can never complete it successfully." His finger moved to another line, tracing it without touching. "This one dampens your scent. Omegas naturally have strong, sweet scents that call to potential mates. But yours is muted, barely there, which made Marcus think you were defective when really you were just bound." Understanding crashed through Ilara like a wave. All those years of being told she was broken, defective, fundamentally wrong, and it had been deliberate. Every symptom, every failure, every painful attempt that ended in humiliation, all of it had been engineered by someone who'd looked at a child and decided she needed to be crippled. Rage blazed through her, hot and sudden, and the binding responded immediately, tightening, silver lines flaring brighter as pain lanced across her chest. She gasped, doubling over, her hands pressing against the table as she fought to breathe through it. Kale was beside her instantly, his hand on her back, his voice low and urgent. "Breathe. Slow and steady. Don't fight the pain, let it pass through you." The binding feeds on resistance, uses your own emotions against you. Ilara tried to obey, tried to relax into the pain instead of tensing against it, but every instinct screamed to fight, to rage, to reject this thing that had been torturing her for 15 years. Her wolf was howling inside her, throwing herself against the binding's restrictions with desperate fury, and the combination of their rage was making everything worse, tighter, more painful. Ilara. Kale's voice cut through the chaos, commanding her attention with alpha authority that her wolf couldn't ignore. Look at me. Focus on my voice. Let everything else fade. She forced her eyes open, found his silver gaze locked on hers, steady and certain and grounding. His hand pressed firmer against her back, right between her shoulder blades, and warmth flooded through her, not painful, not burning, but soothing, like cool water on inflamed skin. That's it, Kale murmured as the pain began to ease. You're doing well. The binding is testing you, seeing how much pressure it takes to make you submit. But you're stronger than it is. You just need to remember that. The pain faded slowly, reluctantly, leaving Ilara shaking and exhausted. She slumped forward, her forehead nearly touching the table, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The rage was still there, simmering beneath her skin, but she'd managed to keep it from consuming her completely. Managed to not let the binding win this round. How many times will that happen? She asked when she could speak again. How many times will I have to ride out that pain before the binding is finally gone? I don't know, Kale admitted, his hand still warm and steady on her back. Every binding is different, crafted to respond to specific triggers. Yours seems particularly sensitive to strong emotion, anger, fear, grief. Whoever created it knew you'd be an emotional person. Knew rage would be your first response to injustice. They designed the binding to punish exactly that. The cruelty of it stole her breath. Not content with simply suppressing her power, they'd created something that would hurt her every time she felt too much, every time she dared to be angry at what had been done to her. It was torture designed to be self-perpetuating, ensuring she'd spend her entire life carefully managing her emotions, making herself smaller, quieter, less than she was meant to be. I hate them, Ilara whispered, and this time she kept the rage contained, channeled it into cold fury instead of explosive anger. Whoever did this to me, I hate them with everything I am. Good, Kale said, surprising her. Hold on to that hate. Let it fuel you. Because when we finally break this binding, when you're finally free, you're going to need that fury to face what comes next. The coalition will test you. They'll push you, provoke you, try to make you lose control so they can justify executing you. Your anger, properly channeled, properly controlled, will be what keeps you alive. He helped her sit up, his hands gentle but firm, supporting her until her strength returned. The food still sat on the table, mostly untouched, but Ilara forced herself to eat a few more bites. She needed to keep her strength up, needed to be ready for tomorrow when the real work would begin. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling, the coalition representatives' presence a distant pressure that couldn't quite penetrate the lodge's thick walls. Outside, night had fallen completely, the forest beyond the windows reduced to shadows and suggestions. Inside, in this small space illuminated by firelight, Ilara felt something she'd rarely experienced in crescent shadow. She felt safe. Not perfectly safe, the binding and coalition's ultimatum made that impossible. But safe enough to breathe, to exist without constantly monitoring every word and gesture, to let her guard down incrementally. Tell me about your warriors, she said eventually, needing to understand the strange family Kale had built, needing to know more about the wolves who'd knelt in acknowledgement when he'd claimed her. How did you find them? Why do they follow you? Kale's expression softened with something that looked like pride mixed with old grief. I didn't find them, they found me. After I was exiled, after I'd spent months wandering alone trying to understand what I was supposed to do with freedom I'd never asked for, word started spreading. Stories about a rogue alpha who wouldn't bow to pack law, who challenged the old hierarchies, who believed outcasts deserved better than perpetual exile. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant with memory. Vera was first. She'd been scarred defending her pack from rogues, and when she couldn't fight at her previous level, they cast her out. Said she was a liability, that feeding a warrior who couldn't win battles was a waste of resources. She tracked me down and demanded I let her prove her worth. Told me scars didn't define capability, that she could still fight better than most whole warriors. And you believed her, Alara said, seeing where this was going. I tested her, Kale corrected. Made her fight 3 of my best. She won 2 bouts decisively and nearly took the 3rd. So yes, I believed her because she proved it. That's how it works with my warriors. I don't accept wolves based on their designation or their bloodline or their past reputation. I accept them based on what they can do, who they choose to be, whether they're willing to fight for something larger than their own survival. His silver eyes found hers again, intense and certain. Most of them have stories like yours, bound by circumstances they didn't choose, cast out for failing to meet impossible standards, deemed too dangerous or too broken to be worth keeping. And every single one of them has proven that the packs who rejected them were fools who couldn't recognize strength when it didn't fit their narrow definitions. The words warmed something in Alara's chest, soothed wounds she hadn't realized were still bleeding. Because if Kale's warriors had faced rejection and emerged stronger, if they'd been deemed worthless and proven that judgment wrong, maybe she could do the same. Maybe her binding and public humiliation weren't the end of her story, but the beginning of something else entirely. I want to meet them, she said suddenly. Properly, I mean. Not just see them guarding the perimeter or standing witness to ceremonies. I want to know their names, their stories, why they chose you over the packs that cast them out. Kale smiled, genuine and warm in ways that transformed his harsh features into something almost approachable. They'd like that. Most of them are curious about you anyway, the flamebringer their alpha claimed, the wolf with fire in her veins. They want to understand what you'll become when the binding finally breaks. What if I disappoint them? The fear escaped before Alara could contain it. What if my power isn't what everyone expects? What if I'm just ordinary underneath all this? Then you'll be ordinary, Kale said simply. And we'll still fight to keep you alive, because your worth isn't measured by how much power you can wield. It's measured by who you are. The courage it took to face those rogues alone, the strength to survive Marcus's rejection without breaking completely, the resilience to sit in this lodge under coalition watch, and still have hope that maybe things can be better. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers where it rested on scarred wood. But I don't think you're ordinary, Alara. I think you're exactly what the goddess showed me. Fire waiting to be unleashed, power that will burn away everything corrupt and broken in the current system. And I think when you finally claim what's yours, the entire realm is going to remember why Flamebringers were revered before they were feared. The conviction in his voice made her want to believe, made her want to trust that maybe, impossibly, she was something worth celebrating instead of something to be pitted or suppressed. But 15 years of being told she was broken didn't vanish overnight, couldn't be erased by promises alone no matter how sincerely offered. I hope you're right, she said quietly. Because if you're wrong, if I'm just a disappointment with a dramatic bloodline, I don't know what I'll do. Then we'll figure it out together, Kale promised, squeezing her hand. Whatever you become, whatever power manifests or doesn't, you're not facing it alone. That's what family means. Standing together even when the outcome is uncertain, even when the path is unclear. Family. The word settled into Alara's chest, into spaces that had been empty for longer than she wanted to admit. Because her birth family had never felt like family, they'd felt like obligation, like burden, like people who tolerated her presence, but never actually wanted her. And her pack had been worse, a constant source of judgment and disappointed expectation. But these warriors, this strange alpha with his silver eyes and hidden scars, the family he was building from society's rejected pieces, maybe that could be different. Maybe that could be the belonging she'd always craved but never found. They sat together as the fire burned lower, as night deepened outside, as the coalition representatives changed shifts with military precision that echoed through the forest. And somewhere in that quiet companionship, Alara felt something shift inside her. Not the binding breaking, not yet, but her own perception changing. She wasn't the broken Omega anymore, wasn't the wolf who needed to apologize for existing wrong. She was Alara Winters, Flamebringer bloodline, survivor of binding and rejection and public humiliation. And she was done letting other people define what she was allowed to become. Tomorrow, they would begin the work of breaking her cage. Tonight, she would rest in the knowledge that whatever happened, she wouldn't face it alone. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, that was enough. The days blurred together in a rhythm that was both exhausting and oddly meditative. Every morning, Alara woke before dawn to find Kale already up, preparing for the day's work. They'd eat together in silence, both conserving energy for what was ahead, while outside the coalition representatives watched and waited and judged. Then they'd begin. Hours of careful, painstaking work as Kale traced the binding structure with magic Alara was only beginning to understand, while she practiced sensing those invisible threads without triggering the pain response that had defined her entire life. It was harder than anything she'd ever attempted. Not physically demanding in the way training or labor might be, but mentally exhausting in ways that left her hollowed out and trembling by day's end. Every session required absolute focus, perfect emotional control, the ability to observe her own cage with detachment even though every fiber of her being screamed to rage against it, to tear it apart, to make someone pay for what had been done to her. But rage triggered the binding. Fear triggered it. Even hope, when it blazed too bright, could make the silver lines flare with pain that drove her to her knees. So she learned to exist in a state of careful neutrality, observing without judging, feeling without reacting, letting Kale's steady presence ground her when the temptation to break became overwhelming. By the 15th day, they'd made real progress. Kale had identified 17 major threads in the binding, each one restricting a different aspect of her power or connection to her wolf. He'd successfully cut 3 of them. Careful incisions that weakened the overall structure without causing catastrophic backlash. And Alara had learned to sense the binding even in rest, to feel its presence like weight pressing against her consciousness, to understand its rhythms and reactions well enough that she could sometimes anticipate when it would tighten before it actually did. It should have felt like victory. Should have been cause for celebration, or at least satisfaction that they were ahead of schedule. Instead, Alara felt increasingly uneasy, like something was building beneath the surface tension that had defined their time in the lodge. The coalition representatives had been too quiet lately, their rotations too precise, their observation too clinical. And twice now, she'd caught them in hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she appeared, their expressions carefully neutral, but their body language screaming secrets. She mentioned it to Kale during their evening meal, voice pitched low despite the thick walls that should have prevented eavesdropping. Something's wrong. The coalition wolves, they're planning something. Kale didn't dismiss her concern, didn't offer false reassurance. Instead, his expression darkened with anger that suggested he'd noticed the same thing. I know. Vera reported seeing messengers arriving at night, wolves who weren't part of the agreed rotation. And the Crescent Shadow contingent has been asking too many questions about your progress, about whether your wolf has started responding differently. What do you think they're planning? Alara asked, though part of her already knew. The coalition had never intended to let her succeed, had never planned to honor their agreement. They'd offered 4 weeks as a formality, a way to appear reasonable while ensuring she'd fail. And now that she was actually making progress, now that the binding was weakening and her power was starting to stir in ways that frightened even her, they were going to move the goalposts. I think they're going to declare you too dangerous before the 4 weeks are up, Kale said bluntly. Cite some clause in pack law that allows for early termination if the threat level changes. They'll claim your partial unbinding has made you unstable, that continuing risks catastrophic power release they can't control. The words settled like stones in Alara's stomach. Can they do that? Can they just change the terms because they don't like the outcome? They can do whatever they want if enough packs agree, Kale said, and the bitterness in his voice spoke of old battles fought and lost against coalition politics. That's how the system works. Might makes right, majority rules, and individual wolves don't matter if their existence threatens pack stability. He pushed away from the table, moving to the window where he could watch the coalition representatives positioning themselves for night watch. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, tension radiating from every line of his body. I won't let them take you. If they try to move against us before the agreed time, we run. I know places even their best trackers couldn't follow, territories where coalition law doesn't reach. And then what? Alara asked, joining him at the window, studying the wolves who held her life in their hands. We hide forever? I spend the rest of my life running, the binding still intact because we never got the chance to finish breaking it? That's not freedom, Kale. That's just a different kind of cage. It's survival, Kale countered, turning to face her, his silver eyes blazing with protective fury. Which matters more than pride or principle if they're planning to execute you. No. The word came out harder than Alara intended, weighted with determination that had been building through 15 days of careful work, through hours of learning to control rage that had consumed her for years. No more running. I'm tired of surviving, Kale. I want to live. And that means finishing what we started, breaking this binding, proving I can control whatever power emerges. Even if the coalition tries to stop us. Something flickered in Kale's expression, approval mixed with concern, respect tempered by fear for her safety. You realize what you're saying? If we defy them, if we continue working on the binding after they order us to stop, it won't just be you they come after. My warriors, everyone who's helped us, they'll all be targets. Then we make sure we succeed before they can stop us, Alara said, and the conviction in her own voice startled her. When had she become this person? When had she transformed from the broken Omega who ran crying into the forest into someone willing to gamble everything on the possibility of freedom? How many threads are left? How much more time do you need? Kale studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, calculation mixing with decision. 14 threads remaining. At our current pace, another 2 weeks minimum. But if I work faster, if I take more risks with each cut, maybe 7 to 10 days. Then work faster, Alara said, even as part of her recoiled at the idea of taking more risks, of pushing the binding harder when every session already left her shaking and exhausted. Whatever happens with the coalition, I want this thing broken before they can use it as an excuse to execute me. Before Kale could respond, before he could argue or agree or offer the caution that usually tempered his promises, a commotion erupted outside. Raised voices, the sound of wolves shifting, Vera's distinctive growl cutting through the chaos with authority that demanded attention. Kale was moving before Alara could process what was happening, his body flowing toward the door with predatory grace, one hand already reaching for the blade he kept strapped to his thigh. Alara followed, her heart hammering, her wolf pressing forward with sudden alertness that made the binding tighten uncomfortably. They emerged from the lodge to find the clearing in chaos. Kale's warriors had formed a defensive line between the lodge and a group of wolves Alara didn't recognize, at least 20 of them, all bearing the marks of Ironwood Pack, all radiating hostility that made the air feel thick and dangerous. And at their head stood someone Alara recognized from the Revelation ritual, one of the younger alphas who'd voted for her execution, his expression twisted with righteous fury. Kale Shadowborn, the alpha called out, his voice carrying across the clearing with practiced authority. By order of the Coalition Council, you are commanded to cease all work on the Flamebringers binding immediately. Further manipulation of the magic is deemed too dangerous to continue. There it was. The betrayal Alara had sensed building, delivered with bureaucratic efficiency that made it seem reasonable, justified, necessary for everyone's safety. Never mind that they still had 2 weeks remaining in their agreed time. Never mind that she'd done nothing to warrant this intervention except make progress toward the freedom they'd supposedly promised. On what grounds? Kale demanded, his voice deadly soft in a way that made several of the Ironwood wolves shift nervously. We have an agreement. For weeks to break the binding safely. We're ahead of schedule, causing no harm, following every stipulation the Coalition imposed. The grounds are simple, the Alpha said, though uncertainty flickered across his features like he wasn't entirely convinced by his own justification. Elder Maris has received reports that the Flamebringer's power is beginning to manifest prematurely. That partial unbinding has created instability that threatens to cascade into uncontrolled release. For the safety of all wolves in the region, the work must stop until the Council can convene and reassess the threat level. It was lies wrapped in enough truth to seem plausible. Yes, Alara's power had started stirring as threads were cut. Yes, she'd felt it pressing against the remaining binding with increasing urgency. But uncontrolled? Dangerous? That was fabrication designed to justify exactly what they were doing, stopping her progress before she could succeed, ensuring she remained caged and manageable. Who filed these reports? Kale asked, and the edge in his voice promised violence if the answer displeased him. Because I've been monitoring her power personally. I've documented every change, every fluctuation, every moment of instability. And nothing suggests uncontrolled release is imminent. The Alpha's jaw tightened, and he glanced toward the coalition representatives who'd been observing from the perimeter. They wouldn't meet his eyes, wouldn't step forward to support his claim, and understanding crashed through Alara like ice water. Marcus. This had Marcus written all over it, his vindictiveness, his need to ensure she failed, his absolute inability to accept that he might have rejected something valuable. He'd filed false reports, or convinced someone else to file them, playing on coalition fears to sabotage her progress. The source of the reports is confidential, the Alpha said, which was as good as confirmation. But the Council has voted. Work on the binding stops immediately. The Flamebringer will be transported to Ironwood territory for observation while Elder Maris convenes a full tribunal to determine next steps. No. Kale's refusal was absolute, backed by power that made the air crackle with pressure. His warriors moved as one, tightening formation, weapons appearing in hands with practiced efficiency. Alara Winters stays here, under my protection, where we can finish the work we started. If the Council wants to convene a tribunal, they can do it here, where we can present evidence of our progress and refute whatever lies have been spread. This isn't a negotiation, the Alpha said, though his voice lacked conviction now, wavering in the face of Kale's certainty. You will surrender the Flamebringer or be declared in violation of coalition law. Your warriors will be branded as rogues, enemies of all lawful pacts. Is that really what you want? For a moment, Alara thought Kale would refuse anyway, would choose his warriors and her freedom over the precarious peace that kept the realm from descending into open warfare. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of costs and benefits, the terrible choice between protecting her and protecting everyone else who'd sworn themselves to his cause. But before he could speak, before he could make that impossible decision, Alara stepped forward. Moved past Kale's protective stance, past his warriors who tried to stop her, until she stood in clear view of the Ironwood Alpha and every coalition representative watching this confrontation unfold. I'll go, she said, and the shock on Kale's face was almost worth the terror flooding through her veins. I'll submit to your observation, cooperate with your tribunal, do whatever Elder Maris requires. But I have conditions. The Alpha blinked, clearly not expecting cooperation, probably anticipating they'd have to take her by force. You're not in a position to make conditions. I'm the only Flamebringer you've seen in generations, Alara countered, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. The only confirmed bloodline carrier whose power you've actually witnessed. That makes me valuable, dangerous, maybe, but valuable enough that you won't risk damaging me if there's another option. So yes, I think I can make conditions. She could feel Kale's fury like a physical presence behind her, could sense his wolf howling with the need to intervene, to stop her from gambling with her life this way. But he held position, trusted her judgment even though it was clearly tearing him apart. What conditions? The Alpha asked warily, and Alara knew she had him. Knew he'd been expecting resistance, violence, anything except rational negotiation from the wolf they'd labeled too dangerous to exist. Kale comes with me, Alara said firmly. Not as a prisoner, but as an advisor. He's the only one who understands the binding structure well enough to explain what's happening as it weakens. If Elder Maris wants accurate information instead of fear-driven speculation, she needs his expertise. The Alpha hesitated, clearly not authorized to make that kind of concession. The Council won't. The Council will accept it or I stop cooperating, Alara interrupted, and she let some of the fire she'd been suppressing leak into her voice. Let her wolf press forward just enough that her eyes probably flashed with power the binding couldn't completely suppress. I'll fight every examination, resist every attempt to assess my power, make your observation utterly useless. Or you can include Kale and get the information you claim to want. Your choice. It was a gamble, counting on their fear of her power to outweigh their desire to separate her from Kale's influence. And for several heartbeats, she thought it might fail, thought the Alpha would refuse, and this entire confrontation would dissolve into violence no one could stop. Then he nodded, grudging but definite. Fine. Kale's Shadowborn accompanies you to Ironwood territory, with 3 of his warriors as escort. But the rest stay here, and any sign of treachery voids the agreement. Are we clear? Crystal, Alara said, ignoring the way her hands were shaking, ignoring the terror screaming through her mind that she'd just volunteered for exactly the kind of observation that would give them every excuse they needed to execute her. Kale's hand closed around her arm, his grip firm enough to convey urgency without causing pain. Alara, you don't have to do this. We can fight, we can run. And then what? She interrupted, echoing his own words from earlier. We hide forever while they hunt your warriors? While they use this as justification to brand everyone associated with you as criminals? No, Kale. This is the only way forward that doesn't destroy everything you've built. She turned to face him fully, meeting those silver eyes that had become so familiar over the past weeks, seeing her own fear and determination reflected back. Besides, she continued, voice dropping low enough that only he could hear, you said you could break the binding faster if you took more risks. So, let's take them. Work on it during their observation, during whatever tests Elder Maris wants to run. Break me free before they can decide I'm too dangerous to live. Understanding flashed across Kale's features, followed immediately by concern and something that looked almost like pride. That's incredibly reckless. I learned from the best, Alara said with a smile that felt more like baring teeth. Are you going to let me do this alone, or are you coming with me? Kale's answer was pulling her close, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like protection and promise and apology all at once. His voice was rough against her ear, weighted with emotion he usually kept carefully controlled. I'm with you. Whatever happens, wherever this leads, I'm with you until the end. The Ironwood Wolves organized themselves with military efficiency, creating a formation that was half escort, half guard as they prepared to transport Alara and her small group to their territory. Kale chose Vera and 2 other warriors Alara had barely spoken to. A massive male named Torin and a younger female called Sable, to accompany them. The rest of his warriors would remain at the lodge, maintaining their position, ready to intervene if the situation deteriorated beyond repair. As they prepared to leave, as Alara gathered the few possessions she'd accumulated during their time in the lodge, Vera pulled her aside with an expression that was equal parts respect and concern. You know this is a trap, Vera said bluntly, keeping her voice pitched low. You know they're separating us deliberately, reducing our numbers, making it easier to execute their real plan, whatever that might be. I know, Alara admitted, because lying to warriors who'd pledged themselves to fighting impossible odds seemed insulting. But staying here wasn't working either. They would have found another excuse, manufactured another crisis, anything to stop us before the binding broke. At least this way, we control the timing. Vera studied her for a long moment, those scarred features revealing nothing, then nodded once. You're braver than I expected. Most Omegas I've known would have collapsed under this pressure, would have begged someone else to make the decisions. But you're thinking like a warrior, assessing threats, calculating odds, choosing the least terrible option from a menu of bad choices. I don't feel brave, Alara confessed. I feel terrified. Like I'm seconds away from making a catastrophic mistake that gets everyone killed. That's what bravery is, Vera said with something that might have been a smile. Doing what needs doing even though you're terrified. Courage without fear is just stupidity. But fear controlled, channeled, used to sharpen your focus. That's what separates warriors from victims. The words settled into Alara's chest, into spaces that had held nothing but doubt and self-recrimination for so long. Maybe she was becoming something different. Maybe the binding's weakening was allowing parts of herself she'd never accessed to finally emerge. Or maybe this was who she'd always been underneath, just waiting for permission to exist without apology. They traveled through the night, moving at a pace that was just shy of punishing, the Ironwood wolves clearly eager to reach their territory before anything could disrupt the transfer. Alara's binding ached with the exertion, tightening periodically in response to stress and fear and the physical demands of maintaining their speed. But she gritted her teeth and pushed through, refusing to show weakness, refusing to give them any excuse to declare her unfit for observation and simply execute her in the forest. Kale stayed close, his presence a constant source of grounding even when he couldn't touch her, couldn't offer the physical comfort that had sustained her through their work in the lodge. Once, when the binding flared with particular intensity and she stumbled, he was there instantly, his hand on her arm, his voice low and urgent. Breathe through it. Don't fight. Let it pass. She obeyed, drawing on everything they'd practiced, letting the pain wash over her without resistance until it faded to manageable levels. The Ironwood wolves watched this interaction with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disgust, probably wondering why their alpha had agreed to let Kale accompany her when his influence was so obvious, so complete. They reached Ironwood territory as dawn broke, emerging from dense forest into cleared land that spoke of careful management and military precision. The pack's settlement was larger than crescent shadows, more organized, buildings arranged in geometric patterns that facilitated defense and rapid mobilization. Warriors patrolled with practiced efficiency, and civilians moved through early morning routines with the kind of coordination that suggested extensive drilling. Alara's wolf stirred uneasily, pressing against the binding with apprehension that had nothing to do with pain. This place felt dangerous in ways the lodge hadn't, in ways even Crescent Shadow hadn't despite her years of suffering there. There was power here, carefully controlled and precisely directed, the kind of power that crushed anything that threatened its order. They were taken to a building at the settlement center. Stone construction, heavily warded, probably where they kept valuable prisoners or dangerous artifacts that required special containment. The interior was sparse, but not cruel, rooms that were functional if not comfortable, windows that let in light but were too small and too high to permit escape. "You'll be housed here during observation," the Ironwood Alpha said, his tone suggesting this was generosity rather than imprisonment. "Elder Maris will arrive tomorrow to begin the assessment. Until then, you're confined to these rooms. Your companions may stay with you, but any attempt to leave the building will be considered hostile action." "Understood," Alara said, maintaining the same calm rationality she'd projected during their initial confrontation. "We'll cooperate fully with whatever assessment Elder Maris deems necessary." The Alpha studied her for a moment longer, something shifting in his expression. Confusion, maybe, or uncertainty about how to categorize the wolf who'd been described as dangerously unstable, but who kept responding with careful reason. Then he withdrew, leaving them under guard but alone, time to process what had happened and prepare for whatever came next. The moment the door closed, Kale rounded on her with barely controlled fury. "That was incredibly reckless. Volunteering to come here, making conditions you have no power to enforce, acting like you're in control when we're clearly prisoners no matter how politely they phrase it." "I know," Alara said, moving to examine the room's limited furnishings, trying to determine what resources they had available. "But what choice did we have? Fighting would have gotten your warriors killed. Running would have made everything worse. This way, at least we're still together, still have a chance to finish what we started." "You assume they'll let us work on the binding," Kale countered. "You assume Elder Maris will be reasonable. That observation means exactly that rather than being code for something else entirely." "What if you're wrong?" What if this tribunal is just formality before they execute you anyway? Then at least I tried something other than passive waiting, Alara shot back, her own fear and frustration bleeding into her voice despite efforts to maintain control. At least I made a choice rather than letting them dictate every aspect of my existence. I've spent my entire life being acted upon, Kale, bound without consent, rejected without warning, marked for execution because I dared to make progress. So yes, maybe coming here was reckless. Maybe it'll get me killed. But at least it was my decision. The words hung between them, weighted with everything they represented: her transformation from victim to agent, her refusal to keep accepting whatever fate others chose for her, her determination to claim some measure of autonomy even if it cost everything. Kale's anger drained away slowly, replaced by something that looked like understanding mixed with grief. He crossed to her, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that contradicted the intensity of their argument. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You're right. You deserve to make your own choices, even when they terrify me. Especially when they terrify me, because that's what growth looks like, stepping into danger with eyes open rather than waiting for someone else to save you." He leaned his forehead against hers, and Alara let her eyes drift closed, drawing strength from his proximity, from the certainty that whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. "We'll finish breaking the binding," Kale promised, his voice low and fierce. "During observation, during tests, during whatever performance Elder Maris requires. I'll work faster, take the risks we discussed, and you'll learn to control what emerges even if it kills us both in the attempt." "That's not reassuring," Alara said, but she was smiling despite the terror churning through her veins. "It's not meant to be," Kale replied. "It's meant to be true. We're past the point of reassurance, past the point of safety and comfort. Now we're in survival mode, gambling everything on the possibility that your power, once freed, will be enough to shift the balance in our favor." He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, his silver gaze burning with intensity that stole her breath. "But understand this, Alara, if it comes down to your life or my own, if the only way to save you is to sacrifice myself, I'll do it without hesitation. You're too important, too precious, too necessary for what's coming to let coalition politics destroy you before you've had the chance to truly live." The vow should have comforted her, should have made her feel protected and valued. Instead, it made her angry. Furious that he would consider himself expendable, that he'd built his entire sense of worth around protecting others rather than believing he deserved protection himself. "Don't you dare," she said, her hands fisting in his shirt, her voice shaking with emotion she couldn't quite name. "Don't you dare sacrifice yourself like it's noble or necessary or the only option. I didn't survive Marcus's rejection and 15 years of binding just to watch you throw your life away. We survived together or not at all. Do you understand me?" Something flickered in Kale's expression, surprise, maybe, or gratification that she'd push back against his protective instincts rather than simply accepting them. His hands slid from her face to her waist, pulling her closer until barely any space remained between them. Together, he agreed, and the word felt like a vow. We survive together. Break free together. Face whatever comes next together. And then he was kissing her. Fierce and desperate and claiming, pouring every emotion he usually kept carefully controlled into this moment of connection. Alara kissed him back with equal intensity, channeling her fear and hope and determination into the press of her lips against his, the way her fingers tangled in his hair, the absolute certainty that whatever happened, this moment was real and true and hers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alara felt the binding strain against her ribs. Not with pain, but with something else, something that felt almost like recognition. Like her power understood that this connection mattered, that Kale mattered, that together they might actually be strong enough to survive what was coming. Outside their prison that wasn't quite a prison, Ironwood Pack continued its precisely ordered existence. Elder Maris was coming tomorrow to begin observation that would determine whether Alara lived or died. The coalition was plotting betrayal that would test every choice they'd made. But inside this small room, With Kale's warmth solid against her and his promise still warming her lips, Alara felt something she'd rarely experienced in her 21 years of existence. She felt ready. Not for victory, that was still uncertain, still dependent on factors beyond her control. But ready to fight for it, to claim whatever future might be possible, to burn bright enough that no one could ever again mistake her for broken. And when the binding finally shattered, when her power finally broke free, the entire realm would understand exactly what they'd tried to suppress when they'd caged a child who was always meant to be fire. Elder Maris arrived at midday, accompanied by an entourage that made Alara's stomach drop with foreboding. Not just coalition representatives from the three packs, but wolves she didn't recognize, elders from territories she'd never heard of, alphas whose power rolled off them in waves that made the air feel thick and oppressive, healers carrying instruments that looked more like torture devices than medical equipment. This was an observation. This was an inquisition, and everyone assembled knew it even if no one would say it aloud. They'd been given an hour's warning. Enough time for Kale to attempt one more session of work on the binding, cutting another thread with precision that made Alara's entire body convulse. With pain, she had to bite back, screaming. 11 threads remaining now, and each one grew harder to sever as the binding's overall structure destabilized, became more volatile, fought back against their attempts to dismantle it. "You need to be careful during the assessment," Kale had said urgently as footsteps approached their chamber. "They'll try to provoke you, push you into losing control, give them justification to declare you too dangerous. Don't let them see how close you are to breaking free." But hiding her progress proved impossible the moment Elder Maris entered the room. Those ancient eyes swept over Alara with assessment that felt like being flayed open, like every secret was being dragged into harsh light. The elder's expression shifted from neutral curiosity to something darker. Concern mixed with fear, mixed with grim determination. "The binding is nearly broken," Elder Maris said flatly, not bothering with pleasantries or careful phrasing. "I can see the fractures in its structure, feel the power straining against what remains." "How many threads have been cut?" Kale stepped forward, positioning himself between Alara and the assembled wolves with protective instinct he couldn't suppress even here, even surrounded by enemies who would use such displays against them. 6 threads successfully removed. 11 remain. The binding is destabilizing as expected, but the process is controlled, managed, exactly as we proposed it would be. "Controlled," one of the unknown alphas repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You call this controlled? I can feel her power from here, pressing against reality like it's trying to tear through. What happens when those last threads snap? What happens when there's nothing holding back Flamebringer power that's been compressed for 15 years? Then she learns to wield it," Kale said simply. "The same way every wolf learns to control their strength, their speed, their animal instincts. Power isn't inherently dangerous, lack of training is dangerous. And you're sabotaging her training by interrupting the process before it's complete." Elder Maris raised her hand, commanding silence from the alphas who'd begun arguing among themselves. Her gaze never left Alara, studying her with intensity that made Alara want to shrink back, make herself smaller, less noticeable. But she forced herself to stand tall, to meet the elder's eyes without flinching, to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Child," Elder Maris said, her voice surprisingly gentle despite the circumstances, "do you understand what will happen when the binding breaks completely? Do you comprehend the forces you'll be expected to control?" "No," Alara admitted, because lying seemed pointless when this female could probably sense deception with the same ease she'd sensed the binding's deterioration. "I've never experienced my full power, never been allowed to explore what Flamebringer bloodline truly means. But I'm willing to learn. Willing to train, to study, to do whatever's necessary to wield it responsibly." "Willingness isn't enough," another elder interjected. A female from one of the distant packs, her silver hair marking her as ancient even by pack standards. Flamebringers weren't just powerful, they were unpredictable. Their gifts came directly from the goddess, which meant they answered to no mortal authority. The last confirmed Flamebringer nearly destroyed an entire region because she believed the goddess had commanded her to cleanse wolves she deemed unworthy. The words hung heavy in the suddenly silent room, weighted with history Alara didn't know, with fears she couldn't address because she had no framework for understanding them. She looked at Kale, found him staring at the elder with expressions suggesting he knew exactly what incident was being referenced and disagreed violently with the interpretation being presented. "The Flamebringer you're referencing," Kale said carefully, his voice tight with controlled fury, "was bound as a child, spent 40 years in captivity, and finally broke free only to find her entire family had been executed as punishment for her bloodline. She wasn't acting on divine command, she was seeking revenge against wolves who'd systematically destroyed everyone she loved. Don't conflate justified rage with inherent instability." Several of the assembled wolves shifted uncomfortably, probably not expecting Kale to know the full story, probably hoping to use the tale as cautionary warning without acknowledging the context that complicated it. Elder Maris's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her ancient eyes, respect, maybe, or acknowledgement that Kale's version was closer to truth than the sanitized legend they'd been spreading. "Regardless of interpretation," Elder Maris said, "the fact remains that Flamebringer power, once unleashed, cannot be easily contained. And this one," she gestured to Alara, "has been bound for 15 years. Whatever emerges when those final threads break will be compressed, volatile, possibly uncontrollable even with the best intentions." "Then help me learn to control it," Alara said, her voice carrying across the room with strength she'd cultivated through weeks of careful practice. "Teach me what Flamebringers could do, what powers I should expect, how others managed their gifts before fear drove you to eliminate the bloodline entirely. Don't just declare me dangerous and execute me without giving me the tools I need to prove you wrong." The plea was calculated, designed to appeal to whatever sense of justice or fairness might exist among these wolves who held her life in their hands. And, for a moment, she thought it might work. Several of the elders exchanged glances, something shifting in their expressions that suggested they were reconsidering their predetermined conclusions. Then Marcus stepped into the room, and Alara's fragile hope shattered like glass. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him at the revelation ritual. Harder. More confident. Like he'd found something in her absence that had transformed him from the insecure male who'd rejected her into something sharper, more dangerous. And the way he looked at her now, not with contempt or pity, but with hunger that made her skin crawl, suggested that whatever he'd found, it had nothing to do with genuine growth and everything to do with recognizing an opportunity he'd previously missed. "Elder Maris," Marcus said with deference that seemed practiced rather than genuine. "Thank you for allowing me to participate in this assessment. As Alara's former intended mate, I believe I can provide valuable insight into her stability and trustworthiness." Kale moved before anyone could stop him, crossing the space between them with predatory speed, his hand closing around Marcus's throat with enough force to make the other male's eyes widen with shock and fear. "You rejected her. Publicly. Cruelly. You have no claim, no right to be here, no authority to speak about her character. Kale." Elder Maris's voice cracked like a whip, commanding obedience that even Kale's fury couldn't entirely override. "Release him. Now." For several heartbeats, Alara thought Kale would refuse, would snap Marcus's neck and accept whatever consequences came from that violence. She could see the calculation in his silver eyes, the weighing of satisfaction against survival. But finally, slowly, he released his grip, shoving Marcus away with enough force to send him stumbling. "Marcus Thorne has standing in this matter," Elder Maris continued, her tone suggesting she wasn't entirely pleased about it, but would uphold the law regardless. "As the one who rejected the mate bond, he can speak to whether the binding's deterioration has affected Alara's designation stability, whether her Omega nature remains intact or has been corrupted by emerging power." Understanding crashed through Alara like ice water. This was the trap. not just observing her power, but questioning whether she was still Omega, still deserving of whatever limited protections that designation provided. If they could declare her designation corrupted, transformed by Flamebringer emergence, they could execute her under entirely different laws, ones that dealt with wolves who'd lost their fundamental nature. Marcus straightened his clothes with hands that shook slightly, his throat already showing bruises from Kale's grip. But his voice was steady when he spoke, pitched to carry to every wolf assembled. When I knew Alara, her Omega designation was barely present. Weak scent, inability to submit properly, constant questioning of authority. I attributed it to her binding, to the defect everyone believed she carried. But now, seeing how the binding's removal has progressed, I wonder if what I sensed was actually corruption beginning even then. That's a lie, Alara said, her voice sharp with fury she couldn't quite contain. My designation was always strong, the binding suppressed it, made it seem weak, but it was there. You rejected me because I didn't perform submission the way you wanted, because I questioned you when you were wrong, because I refused to be the docile thing you thought Omegas should be. Exactly, Marcus said, and triumph flashed across his features. You refused to be what your designation demanded. You fought against natural order, against instincts that should have been unbreakable. That's not the binding's effect, that's corruption. Flamebringer power overriding Omega nature, creating something unnatural, something that can't exist within proper pack hierarchy. Several of the alphas nodded, clearly finding this argument persuasive, clearly relieved to have justification that didn't require them to acknowledge the cruelty of binding children or the injustice of executing someone for having power they'd been born with. If Alara's designation was corrupted, if she was becoming something that couldn't fit into their carefully maintained order, then killing her was just maintaining stability rather than murder. Elder Maris studied Alara with those ancient, knowing eyes, and Alara couldn't read what she saw there, judgment or curiosity or something else entirely. There is a test, the Elder said slowly, that can determine designation stability. It's old, rarely used anymore because modern wolves consider it barbaric. But it would provide definitive proof of whether Alara's Omega nature remains intact or has been compromised by emerging power. What kind of test? Kale demanded, suspicion making his voice rough. Alpha dominance, Elder Maris said simply, and the room went utterly silent. An Omega in the presence of overwhelming alpha authority should submit involuntarily, its designation instinct, unbreakable unless the fundamental nature has been corrupted. We assemble sufficient alphas, project coordinated dominance, and observe whether Alara's body responds as an Omega should. Horror flooded through Alara, cold and viscous. They wanted to force her submission, to use alpha power like a weapon that would drive her to her knees whether she consented or not. And if she resisted, if the binding's deterioration or her emerging power gave her strength to fight back, they would declare her corrupted and execute her for the crime of refusing to be broken. No, Kale said flatly. Absolutely not. That test is torture disguised as assessment, designed to humiliate and traumatize. I won't allow it. You don't have authority to refuse, one of the alphas said coldly. The test is within established protocols for designation verification. If Alara's nature is intact, she'll submit naturally, without pain, without resistance. It's only corrupted wolves who suffer during the process. That's not true, and you know it, Kale snarled, power rolling off him in waves that made several wolves step back. Forced submission damages, even stable designations, creates trauma that takes years to heal. You're not testing her stability, you're breaking her spirit, so she can't fight back when you execute her anyway. Elder Maris raised her hand again, commanding silence that fell over the assembled wolves like a physical weight. Her gaze moved between Alara and Kale, something calculating behind those ancient eyes, like she was measuring probabilities and outcomes that existed beyond anyone else's awareness. There is an alternative, the Elder said carefully. Not a test, but a demonstration. If Alara's power is truly beginning to manifest, if Flamebringer gifts are awakening as the binding weakens, she should be able to demonstrate control. Not full mastery, that would be unreasonable to expect before the binding is completely broken. but enough control to prove she's aware of the power, capable of directing it consciously, not simply a vessel for forces she can't comprehend. What kind of demonstration? Elara asked, her voice steadier than she felt, her hands clenched at her sides to hide their trembling. Flamebringers could call fire, Elder Maris said, watching Elara's face closely for reaction. Not physically, they couldn't burn forests or incinerate enemies with thought alone. But they could manifest spiritual flame, silver fire that revealed truth and burned away deception. If you can call even a spark of that flame, if you can show us that your power responds to conscious will rather than mindless instinct, it would go far toward proving you're not the threat Marcus claims. It was another trap, just more subtle than the dominance test. Because Elara had no idea how to call fire, spiritual or otherwise. She'd felt her power stirring as threads were cut, had sensed something vast and ancient beginning to wake inside her, but actual control? Actual manifestation of abilities she'd never been taught to use? That was asking for the impossible, ensuring she'd fail and give them justification to execute her. But looking at the assembled wolves, at the mixture of fear and anticipation on their faces, Elara understood something crucial. They wanted her to fail. Wanted proof that Flamebringers were too dangerous, too unpredictable, too powerful to be allowed existence. Her success would force them to question everything they believed about power and designation, and who deserved to wield authority. And some part of her, the part that had survived 15 years of binding, that had endured Marcus's public rejection, that had volunteered to come here knowing it was probably a death sentence. That part wanted to succeed not despite their expectations, but because of them. Wanted to prove that everything they feared about her was absolutely true, and that their fear was the problem, not her power. "I'll try," Elara said, meeting Elder Maris's eyes with determination that felt like jumping off a cliff with no certainty there was ground below. "I'll attempt to call the fire. But I need time to prepare, and I need Kale with me. If this is truly about demonstrating control, then having someone who understands the binding structure present is essential for safety." Several of the alphas began arguing immediately, insisting that Kale's presence would somehow taint the demonstration, that his influence might help her cheat in ways they couldn't define but were certain existed. But Elder Maris silenced them with a look, her attention never leaving Elara's face. "Agreed," the Elder said. "You have until sunset. We'll reconvene in the ceremonial grounds where there's space for observers to maintain safe distance. Kale may assist with preparation, but must not interfere during the actual demonstration. If you succeed in calling even the smallest flame, we'll continue breaking the binding under supervision. If you fail," she paused, letting the implication hang heavy. "If you fail, the Council will vote on whether to proceed with the dominance test or move directly to more permanent solutions." Execution. She meant execution, just couldn't say it aloud in front of witnesses who might object to the euphemism's transparency. The assembled wolves withdrew, leaving Elara and her small group alone in the chamber that felt more like a cell with every passing moment. The moment the door closed, Vera was moving, checking for surveillance enchantments or listening spells that might let the coalition eavesdrop on their planning. "It's clean," Vera announced after a tense minute. "Whatever magic is warding this building, it's defensive rather than observational. We can speak freely." Kale rounded on Elara immediately, his expression torn between fury and fear and something that looked almost like pride. "Why did you agree to that? You can't call fire. You've never even attempted it. This is just another way for them to ensure you fail." "I know," Elara said, moving to the window where late afternoon light filtered through, counting the hours until sunset. "But the alternative was the dominance test, which would have destroyed me whether I submitted or not. At least this way, if I fail attempting something I chose rather than breaking under force I couldn't resist." "There has to be another option," Kale insisted, pacing the small space like a caged wolf, his frustration making the air feel thick and dangerous. "We could run now, before the demonstration. My warriors could create a distraction, give us time to reach the border." "And then we're fugitives forever," Elara interrupted, turning to face him fully. "Your family becomes hunted, Every wolf who ever helped us becomes a target, and I never get to discover what I actually am beneath this binding. No, Kale. Running isn't the answer anymore. If we're going to survive, I need to do the impossible. I need to call fire I've never accessed, demonstrate control I've never practiced, prove to an audience that wants me dead that I'm worth keeping alive. The words should have sounded insane, should have been the desperate rambling of someone who'd given up hope. Instead, they felt almost calm, weighted with acceptance of what had to happen next. Elara had spent her entire life being acted upon, accepting whatever fate others chose for her. Today, at sunset, she would choose for herself. Would reach for power she didn't understand and either claim it or die trying. Kale stopped pacing, his silver eyes locked on hers with intensity that stole her breath. How? How do we make this work when you've never attempted anything like it before? The same way we've done everything else, Elara said, moving toward him with certainty that felt like faith. Together. You understand the binding structure, can sense where the remaining threads are weakest. And I can feel my power pressing against those threads, trying to break through. What if we combine both? What if you cut one more thread, just one, the one that's holding back whatever part of me controls fire, and I try to channel what emerges? That's incredibly dangerous, Kale said, but his tone suggested he was already calculating whether it might work, already considering how to execute the plan with minimal risk of catastrophic failure. Cutting a thread without proper preparation, without full mapping, increases the chance of violent backlash exponentially. The binding could snap completely, release everything at once. Then I'll burn, Elara said simply. But at least it'll be my choice. My fire. Not their dominance, not their execution, not their careful management of what I'm allowed to be. Mine. Something shifted in Kale's expression, resistance crumbling under the weight of her determination. He crossed to her, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that contradicted the violence he was capable of, his forehead pressing against hers in a gesture that had become their private language. If we do this, he said quietly, if we attempt to cut another thread now, you need to understand what you're asking. The remaining threads are all load-bearing, removing any one of them destabilizes the entire structure. Your power won't emerge gently. It'll explode outward like pressure being released from a sealed vessel. And I can't predict how your body will handle that surge. I understand, Elara said, though understanding and being prepared were different things entirely. But it's better than any alternative they're offering. So teach me. In the hours we have left, teach me everything you know about Flamebringer abilities, about how spiritual fire manifests, about what I should try to do if my power breaks free. They spent the remaining hours in intense preparation, Kale sharing everything he'd learned from ancient texts and forbidden histories about wolves who could call fire that revealed truth and burned away deception. It wasn't combat magic, wasn't meant for destruction, but for illumination, making visible what others tried to hide, forcing lies into light where they couldn't survive. The last Flamebringers had been revered as judges and truth speakers, wolves who could settle disputes by revealing whose claims were genuine and whose were fabrication. And the Alpha families had eliminated them because no one wanted their lies exposed, their corruption made visible, their claims to authority revealed as nothing more than carefully maintained fiction. The fire responds to intention, Kale explained, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting lessons learned and memorized. You can't force it, that just results in power turning inward, burning you instead of manifesting externally. But if you call to it, if you ask rather than demand, it should respond. The trick is not thinking of it as your power, but as a gift the goddess placed in your bloodline, something you're borrowing rather than wielding. Elara tried to internalize the advice, tried to imagine herself as vessel rather than source, but 15 years of being told she was powerless made the mental shift difficult. How did you call to something you'd never been allowed to access? How did you trust in gifts that had been systematically suppressed? As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, as shadows lengthened and the time for demonstration approached, Kale prepared to cut one more thread. He'd chosen carefully, studying the binding structure with intensity that made sweat bead on his forehead, finally identifying a thread that, in theory, restricted her access to spiritual fire specifically rather than power in general. "Are you ready?" he asked, his hands hovering over her chest where the binding's pattern glowed silver against her skin. "No," Alara admitted. "But I don't think I'll ever be ready, so we might as well proceed anyway." Kale's smile was brief, but genuine, pride and fear and something deeper flickering across his features. Then his hands descended, his power flowing through touch, seeking the thread he'd identified. Alara felt the moment he found it, a sharp, bright sensation like a string being plucked, reverberating through her entire being. And then he cut and the world exploded. Pain and power and pressure released all at once, flooding through Alara's body with force that drove her to her knees, that tore a scream from her throat despite every intention to stay silent. Her vision widened out, sound disappeared, every sense overwhelmed by the torrent of energy that had been compressed for 15 years and was finally, violently, breaking free. Silver flame erupted across her skin, not burning but blazing, making the entire chamber glow with light that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. She could hear Kale shouting something, feel his hands on her shoulders trying to ground her, but his voice seemed to come from very far away, filtered through layers of power that separated her from normal reality. And then, impossibly, the chaos resolved into clarity. The fire stopped feeling like chaos and started feeling like extension of herself, like limbs she'd always possessed but had never been taught to use. She could feel it responding to her consciousness, to her intention, to the desperate need to prove she was more than they claimed, stronger than they believed, worthy of the life they wanted to take. Alara opened her eyes, when had she closed them, and found the chamber transformed. Silver fire covered every surface, not consuming but illuminating, making visible things that had been hidden. She could see the magical structure of the wards protecting the building, could sense the emotions of every wolf stationed nearby, could feel truth and lies pressing against her consciousness like physical weight. And most importantly, she could control it. Could direct the fire to burn brighter or dim, could shape it into forms that had meaning, could use it to reveal rather than destroy. Alara. Kale's voice finally penetrated, and she turned to find him staring at her with expression somewhere between awe and terror. "You did it. You're calling the fire." "I can feel it," she breathed, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, layered with harmonics that hadn't existed before. "Everything. Truth and lies and fear and hope. It's like the entire world is suddenly visible in ways I couldn't perceive before." "Can you maintain control?" Kale asked urgently. "When we go to the ceremonial grounds, when you're surrounded by wolves who want you dead, can you keep the fire from consuming everything?" Alara focused inward, testing the connection between her consciousness and the power flowing through her. It was stronger than she'd expected, but not overwhelming, not mindless instinct that demanded release regardless of consequence. This was hers, responsive to her will, controllable with effort, potentially dangerous, but not inevitably so. "Yes," she said with certainty that surprised her. "I can control it. Not perfectly, I'll need years of practice to master something this complex. But enough. Enough to show them I'm aware, capable, not just a vessel for forces I don't comprehend." The remaining hours passed in a blur of preparation and last-minute instruction, Kale drilling her on how to call the fire in controlled bursts, how to demonstrate specific abilities without overwhelming observers, how to project confidence even if uncertainty consumed her. And through it all, Alara felt the binding's remaining threads straining, weakening, coming closer to complete failure with every moment that passed. 10 threads left. Just 10 barriers between her and whatever she was truly meant to be. And tonight, at sunset, she would show the coalition exactly why they should fear that emergence, not because she was dangerous, but because she was powerful enough to challenge every lie they'd built their authority upon. When the summons came, when guards arrived to escort them to the ceremonial grounds, Alara stood with Kale at her side and silver fire flickering just beneath her skin. Visible to anyone with the sense to look, announcing to every wolf she passed that something fundamental had changed, that the broken Omega they dismissed was becoming something they could no longer ignore. The ceremonial grounds were larger than she'd expected, clearly designed for pack gatherings that numbered in hundreds rather than dozens. Stone pillars marked the space's boundaries, carved with symbols similar to the ones she'd seen at the ancient shrine where Kale had first brought her. And assembled in that space, arranged in careful formation that suggested military organization, were more wolves than Alara had ever seen in one place, representatives from every pack in the region, witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. Elder Maris stood at the space's center, her silver hair gleaming in the dying light, her expression unreadable. Marcus was there too, positioned among the Crescent Shadow contingent, his face a mask of anticipation that made Alara's stomach turn. And scattered throughout the crowd were the alphas who'd voted for her execution, who'd filed false reports about her instability, who wanted nothing more than to see her fail and give them justification to eliminate the threat she represented. But Alara also saw others, wolves whose expressions suggested uncertainty rather than condemnation, who looked at her with curiosity mixed with something that might have been hope. Young wolves, mostly, probably designated Omega or low rank, who understood what it meant to be judged worthless by systems that valued power over potential. She was doing this for them as much as herself. Proving that designation didn't determine destiny, that wolves labeled weak or broken or defective might actually be something else entirely. Proving that fear of power was often just fear of losing control, and that those who claimed authority through suppression deserved to be challenged. Alara Winters, Elder Maris called out, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd with practiced ease. You stand accused of designation corruption, of allowing Flamebringer power to override Omega nature, of becoming something that cannot exist within established pack hierarchy. You've been offered the chance to prove these accusations false by demonstrating conscious control of emerging abilities. Are you prepared to make that demonstration? I am, Alara said, her voice steadier than she felt, carrying to every corner of the ceremonial grounds with clarity that made several wolves shift uncomfortably. Then show us, Elder Maris commanded. Call the fire that reveals truth. Let every wolf assembled witness whether you wield your power or it wields you. This was it. The moment everything hinged on, the choice that would determine whether she lived or died, whether Flamebringers returned to the realm or remained extinct. Alara closed her eyes, reaching inward to where her power waited, no longer caged by the binding, but flowing freely, responsive to her consciousness, eager to finally be acknowledged after 15 years of forced suppression. And she called. Silver fire erupted around her, blazing into existence, with force that made the entire assembly gasp and step back. But Alara held control, shaped the flames into forms that had meaning, a wolf running free, unbound, and powerful. A moon rising over gathered pack. And finally, most importantly, a hand extended in offering rather than fist clenched in threat. The fire illuminated the ceremonial grounds with light that was simultaneously beautiful and revealing, making visible things people had tried to hide. Alara could see lies written across faces like brands, wolves who'd falsified reports, who'd accepted bribes, who'd voted based on fear rather than justice. And she could see truth too. Sincerity in unexpected places, hope where she'd expected only condemnation, wolves who genuinely wanted her to succeed even if it challenged everything they'd been taught to believe. She opened her eyes and found every wolf staring at her with expressions ranging from terror to awe to something that looked almost like reverence. The fire continued to blaze, responding to her will, demonstrating control that couldn't be faked or misinterpreted. Is this what you wanted to see? Alara asked, her voice resonating with harmonics the fire added, making her words feel layered with meaning beyond their surface content. Proof that I'm aware? That I can control what emerges? That I'm not mindless instinct but conscious choice. Elder Maris stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in those ancient eyes, calculation mixing with decision, old certainties crumbling under the weight of what she was witnessing. Then, slowly, the elder bowed her head. Not submission, but acknowledgement. Recognition that Alara had done exactly what she'd claimed she could, had demonstrated mastery that shouldn't have been possible for someone still partially bound. "The demonstration is accepted," Elder Maris said formally, her voice carrying to every assembled wolf. "Alara Winters has proven conscious control of Flamebringer abilities. Her designation remains stable despite power emergence. There are no grounds for execution under the charges brought against her." Relief flooded through Alara so intensely she almost lost control of the fire, almost let it blaze out of control with the force of emotion crashing through her. But she held on, maintained the flames at steady intensity, showing that even extreme emotion wouldn't compromise her control. But then Marcus stepped forward, his expression twisted with fury that he tried and failed to mask as concern. "This proves nothing. She's still dangerous, still a threat to every pack in the region. Her power will only grow stronger as more threads are cut. Are we really going to wait until she's fully unbound to realize the mistake we've made?" Several alphas murmured agreement, clearly not ready to abandon their fear despite evidence that contradicted it. And Alara realized with sick certainty that this wasn't over, that Marcus would keep finding reasons to question her stability, keep manufacturing crises that justified his desire to see her dead. "You want me to prove I'm not dangerous?" Alara said, her voice cutting through the murmurs, the fire blazing brighter in response to her rising anger. "Then let me show you what true danger looks like." She reached deeper into her power, past the controlled demonstrations and careful displays, into the core of what Flamebringer bloodline actually meant. The fire responded instantly, blazing across the ceremonial grounds with intensity that made wolves scatter, that made even the alphas step back with expressions transformed from skepticism to genuine fear. And then she directed it. Not at the assembled wolves, but at Marcus specifically, silver flames surrounding him in a column that didn't burn but revealed. Made visible every lie he'd told, every manipulation he'd engaged in, every false report he'd filed to sabotage her progress. The fire showed it all, projected it onto the air like images on smoke, ensuring every wolf assembled could see exactly what kind of male he truly was. Marcus screamed, not from physical pain, but from the agony of having his worst truths exposed, his carefully maintained lies stripped away. And when the fire finally faded, when Alara pulled it back under control with effort that made her hands shake, Marcus stood revealed as exactly what she'd always known him to be, not a righteous male protecting his pack, but a vindictive coward who'd sabotaged her because he couldn't accept that he'd rejected something valuable. "That's what I could do if I chose danger," Alara said quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness. "I could reveal every lie spoken here tonight, could expose every alpha whose authority rests on corruption rather than genuine strength. But I won't. Because unlike what you fear, my power isn't about destruction, it's about truth. And the only wolves who have reason to fear truth are those who've built their lives on lies." Silence fell across the ceremonial grounds, absolute and profound. Every wolf stared at her with new understanding, with the recognition that she wasn't just powerful, but potentially more dangerous than they'd imagined, not because she would use violence, but because she could make visible everything they wanted hidden. Elder Maris moved forward, her expression unreadable, but her voice carrying unmistakable authority. "The demonstration is concluded. Alara Winters has proven not only control but restraint. The ability to wield devastating power while choosing mercy over vengeance. The binding will be removed completely under supervised conditions, and upon its completion, she will be granted full autonomy. No pack may restrict her movement or question her designation." Is this understood? It wasn't really a question. It was a command, backed by elder authority that even the assembled alphas wouldn't challenge directly. Several of them looked like they wanted to argue, wanted to find some loophole or technicality that would let them reclaim control. But faced with what Alara had just demonstrated, faced with the knowledge that she could expose their own lies with equal ease, they remained silent. Marcus tried to speak, tried to protest, but the wolves around him were already pulling away, dissociating themselves from the male whose corruption had been revealed so thoroughly. Whatever authority he'd possessed in Crescent Shadow, whatever respect he'd commanded, it was gone now. And he would spend the rest of his life rebuilding a reputation that Alara's fire had burned to ash. Kale appeared at her side, his hand finding hers, his presence grounding her as the fire finally faded completely, retreating back into whatever space inside her it lived when not manifested. She could still feel it there, waiting, responsive to her will but no longer demanding release. Controlled. Hers. You did it, he said softly, pride and relief and something deeper making his voice rough. You showed them exactly what you are, powerful and merciful and absolutely terrifying to anyone with something to hide. Is it over? Alara asked, her body starting to shake with delayed reaction, with the weight of what she'd just done settling into her bones. Can we finally finish breaking the binding without interference? It's over, Kale confirmed, pulling her closer, his arms coming around her in an embrace that felt like protection and celebration and promise all at once. They can't touch you now. You've proven everything they feared and more, but you've also proven you won't use that power recklessly. That's what will keep you alive, not being harmless, but being powerful enough that attacking you would cost more than any of them are willing to pay. The assembled wolves began to disperse, some quickly as if eager to escape her presence, others more slowly, casting glances back at her that ranged from fear to fascination to something that looked almost like worship. The young wolves especially, the ones designated weak or broken or insufficient, stared at her with expressions suggesting they'd just witnessed something transformative, proof that the system that had judged them worthless might not be infallible after all. Elder Maris approached, her ancient eyes studying Alara with renewed interest, like she was seeing something she hadn't expected to find. You surprised me, child. I thought you would demonstrate basic control, maybe call a small flame, prove minimal competence. Instead, you wielded truth fire with precision I haven't seen since the last confirmed Flamebringer died 3 generations ago. I had good motivation, Alara said, her voice still carrying harmonics that hadn't entirely faded. And an excellent teacher. She glanced at Kale, acknowledging his role in everything that had brought her to this moment. The binding's removal will proceed tomorrow, Elder Maris continued. I will oversee it personally, ensure the process is completed safely. The remaining threads are few enough that Kale should be able to cut them all in a single session, provided you can maintain the control you've demonstrated tonight. I can, Alara said with certainty that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. Whatever emerges when the final threads break, I'll be ready for it. The elder nodded, something that might have been approval flickering across her features. Then she withdrew, leaving them alone in the ceremonial grounds as night fell completely and stars emerged overhead. The same stars that had witnessed Alara's flight from the mating ceremony, that had watched her stumble into the forbidden forest, that had been burning when Kale first appeared and claimed her as his own. How much had changed in such a short time? How completely her world had transformed from the night Marcus rejected her to this moment, standing in fire of her own making, surrounded by wolves who finally saw her as something other than broken. What happens now? Alara asked quietly, leaning into Kale's warmth, letting herself rest for the first time in hours that felt like years. After the binding is gone, after I'm free, what do we do then? Kale was silent for a moment, his hand stroking through her hair with gentle repetition that suggested he was thinking, planning, considering futures that were suddenly possible. That depends on what you want. You could stay with my warriors, join the family we're building from outcasts and rogues. Or you could return to Crescent Shadow, reclaim a position there using your power to demand the respect they never gave freely. I'm never going back there, Alara said immediately, the thought of returning to the pack that had bound her making her wolf snarl with rejection. That place was never home. Those wolves were never family. I don't care what position I could claim or what respect I could demand, I don't want anything from them except distance. Then stay with me, Kale said, and the vulnerability in his voice made Alara's breath catch. Stay with us. Help me build something better than the system that tried to destroy us both. Use your power to expose corruption, to protect wolves who can't protect themselves, to be the truth speaker our kind desperately needs even if they don't realize it yet. It wasn't a request for a mate bond. That would have to wait until she was fully unbound, until she could make that choice without the binding's influence distorting her judgment. But it was an invitation to belong somewhere, to be part of something larger than herself, to use her gifts in service of wolves who needed exactly what she could provide. Yes, Alara said simply, the word feeling like coming home. Yes, I'll stay. I'll fight. I'll burn away every lie that lets predators hide among those they're supposed to protect. And I'll prove that Flamebringers weren't eliminated because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient to wolves who wanted to rule through fear rather than justice. Kale's smile was devastating, transforming his harsh features into something almost beautiful. He pulled her closer, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that tasted like promise and possibility and the beginning of something neither of them could fully predict, but both were willing to risk everything to discover. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the ceremonial grounds were empty except for Vera and the other warriors who'd maintained their protective perimeter throughout the demonstration. They approached now, their expressions ranging from pride to relief to barely contained excitement. That, Vera said with satisfaction that made her scars crease differently, was the most spectacular display of controlled violence I've witnessed in my entire life. You didn't just prove you could wield power, you proved you could choose when not to, which is infinitely more terrifying to wolves who've never had to make that choice. She terrified them, Torin agreed, the massive male's voice rumbling with approval. Half those alphas will spend the next month wondering what lies you might expose if they anger you. The other half will spend it trying to recruit you to their side. Let them wonder, Alara said, silver fire flickering briefly across her skin before she pulled it back under control. I'm done caring what alphas think of me, done trying to prove I deserve to exist. They can fear me or respect me or hate me, as long as they leave me alone to become whatever I'm meant to be. Sable, the youngest of Kale's warriors, moved closer with expression suggesting she'd been waiting for the right moment to speak. What you did tonight. Exposing Marcus's lies, showing everyone that truth fire exists and works, that's going to change things for a lot of us. Wolves who've been labeled defective or broken or insufficient, who've accepted those judgments because we didn't have proof they were wrong. You gave us that proof. The words settled into Alara's chest, into spaces that had held only pain and self-doubt for so long. Because she hadn't just proven something about herself tonight. She'd proven something about every wolf the system had dismissed, had shown that maybe the defect wasn't in them but in the structure that couldn't accommodate anything outside narrow definitions of acceptable. Then let's make sure that proof matters, Alara said, looking at each of Kale's warriors in turn. Let's build something that gives wolves like us, wolves who don't fit the molds we're given, a place to belong without apology. Let's become the family that accepts strength in all its forms, not just the ones pack hierarchy recognizes. They stood together in the ceremonial grounds as night deepened, as the first watchfires were lit in Ironwood Settlement, as the realm continued its existence unaware that something fundamental had just shifted in its foundations. Tomorrow, the binding would break completely. Tomorrow, Alara would discover what she truly was beneath 15 years of suppression. But tonight, in this moment of fragile victory, she let herself feel something she'd rarely experienced in her 21 years of existence. She felt powerful. Not despite being broken, not in spite of being rejected, but because of everything she'd survived, everything she'd endured, everything she'd refused to let destroy her completely. The rejected Omega was gone, burned away by silver fire that revealed truth. And in her place stood something the realm had tried to eliminate, but had never quite managed to destroy completely. A Flamebringer. Awake. Aware. And absolutely done with being told what she was allowed to become. The breaking happened at dawn. Elder Maris had assembled a small group to witness, not the hostile crowd from the night before, but wolves who understood what this moment represented. Transformation. Rebirth. The return of power that had been systematically eliminated from the bloodlines because it threatened those who ruled through fear rather than genuine strength. Ilara knelt at the ceremonial ground center, Kale positioned behind her with his hands hovering over the binding's remaining threads. 10 of them left, just 10 barriers between her and whatever she was meant to be. She could feel them straining now, weakened by yesterday's demonstration, by the power that had flooded through when she'd called the fire. They wouldn't hold much longer regardless of whether Kale cut them. The question was whether they'd break cleanly or shatter catastrophically. "Are you ready?" Kale asked, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Once I start cutting, I can't stop until all the threads are severed. It's going to hurt. Probably worse than anything you've experienced before. And what emerges when the binding finally breaks? I can't predict how intense it will be." "I'm ready," Ilara said, though ready felt like an inadequate word for what she was feeling. Terrified. Exhilarated. Determined. All of those and more, swirling together into something too complex to name. "Cut them. All of them. Let me finally know what I am." Kale's hands descended, his power flowing through touch, seeking the threads that had held her captive for 15 years. And then he began to cut, one after another in rapid succession, each severed thread sending shockwaves of pain and power through Ilara's body that made her vision white out, made breathing impossible, made everything disappear except the sensation of barriers breaking and pressure releasing and something vast waking inside her. The first 5 threads snapped cleanly, their structure weakened enough that cutting them was almost easy. But the last 5 fought back, the binding's survival instinct activating, trying to preserve what remained even as its foundation crumbled. Ilara felt them tighten, felt magic designed 15 years ago trying one final time to cage what it had been created to suppress. And then, with a sound like reality tearing, they shattered. Power exploded through Ilara with force that drove her forward onto her hands and knees, that made her scream with agony and ecstasy so intertwined she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Silver fire erupted from her skin, not controlled demonstration, but wild manifestation of everything that had been compressed and bound and forced into impossible smallness. It blazed across the ceremonial grounds, reaching toward the sky like flames that had finally remembered they were meant to burn. She could feel her wolf surging forward, no longer trapped behind invisible barriers, but free to claim her rightful place. The transformation began, not the painful, incomplete shifts of her past, but something fluid and right, her body reshaping itself with ease that felt almost effortless. Bones rearranged, muscles reformed, her consciousness expanding to accommodate perspectives she'd never been allowed to access. And then she was fully wolf for the first time in her life, standing on 4 legs that felt powerful rather than weak, breathing through lungs that worked perfectly, seeing through eyes that perceived more than human vision ever could. Her fur was unusual. Silver white like her fire, marked with patterns that seemed to shift and change as she moved, never quite settling into fixed configuration. She was beautiful, powerful, whole in ways she'd never been before. The wolves assembled stepped back with expressions ranging from awe to terror, clearly not expecting the transformation to be so complete, so dramatic. Even Kale looked stunned, his silver eyes wide as he took in what she'd become. But Ilara barely noticed their reactions. She was too focused on the feeling of finally being complete, of wolf and human consciousness merging seamlessly instead of fighting against artificial barriers. This was what she'd been missing her entire life, this sense of wholeness, of unity between the parts of herself that should never have been separated. She shifted back to human form, another easy, fluid transformation that left her gasping, but not in pain. The silver fire still flickered across her skin, but it was controlled now, responsive to her will, no longer threatening to consume everything around her. "Ilara." Kale's voice carried uncertainty she'd rarely heard from him. How do you feel?" "Free," she breathed, the word inadequate for the profound sense of liberation flooding through her. "I feel free. Like I've been walking underwater my entire life and someone finally pulled me to the surface where I can breathe." She looked down at her hands, watched silver fire dance across her palms without burning, felt power flowing through her veins that was simultaneously ancient and brand new. This was what the binding had suppressed, not just the ability to shift, not just connection to her wolf, but this sense of being fully present in her own existence, of inhabiting her body and power without restriction. Elder Maris approached, her expression thoughtful rather than fearful. The binding is completely broken. Your wolf is free. Your power is manifested. By all measures of pack law, you are now autonomous. No restrictions, no supervision, no authority over you except what you choose to accept. The words should have felt like victory, like the culmination of everything they'd fought for. And part of Alara did feel triumph, satisfaction that she'd survived when so many forces had conspired to ensure she wouldn't. But another part, the part that had spent 15 years caged, felt something more complicated. Grief for the years stolen from her. Rage at the wolves who'd bound a child because they feared what she might become. And underneath both emotions, a sense of responsibility that was almost overwhelming. Because she wasn't just Alara Winters anymore, rejected Omega who'd somehow survived impossible odds. She was a flamebringer. Possibly the only one left in the entire realm, carrier of gifts that had been systematically eliminated, living proof that the old family's fears had been justified even if their response to those fears had been monstrous. What do I do now? She asked, looking at Kale with vulnerability she couldn't quite hide. I'm free, but I don't know what that means. Don't know what I'm supposed to become, or how to use this power, or what responsibility comes with being the only flamebringer anyone has seen in generations. Kale's expression softened, and he moved closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with familiar gentleness. You become whatever you choose. That's what freedom means, not having a predetermined path, not being told what your designation or bloodline requires, but making your own decisions about who you want to be. But I could help wolves like me, Alara said, the responsibility crystallizing into something clearer, more defined. Wolves who've been labeled defective or broken, who've been told they're worthless because they don't fit into neat categories. I could use truth fire to expose the lies keeping them trapped. I could prove that the system is flawed, not the wolves it rejects. You could, Kale agreed. But you don't have to. You don't owe the realm anything, Alara. Not after what was done to you, not after 15 years of torture disguised as protection. If you want to walk away, to live quietly somewhere they'll never find you, to use your power only for yourself, that would be completely justified. The permission to be selfish, to choose her own peace over responsibility to others, was tempting. Part of her wanted exactly that. To disappear into obscurity, to never again let others' expectations define her choices, to finally just exist without the weight of others' judgment or needs pressing down on her. But looking at the assembled wolves, at Vera and Torin and Sable who'd pledged themselves to Kale's vision of a better world, at the young wolves in the distance who'd watched her demonstration and found hope in her success, Alara knew she couldn't walk away. Not when she finally had power to make change, when she could be the advocate she desperately needed when she was 6 years old and being held down while strangers bound her wolf. I want to help, she said firmly. Not because I owe anyone, not because it's my responsibility as a flamebringer, but because I choose to. Because I know what it's like to be powerless, and now that I'm not, I want to use that power to protect wolves who are still trapped in systems designed to break them. Kale's smile was proud, approving, but also tinged with concern she understood completely. Then we'll do it together. You expose the lies, I'll provide the structure and protection, and we'll build something that gives rejected wolves a place to belong. But he paused, his expression growing more serious. You need to understand what you're choosing. The packs won't tolerate this kind of challenge to their authority. They'll come after us, probably sooner rather than later. Becoming that advocate means accepting danger, possibly for the rest of your life. I've been in danger my entire life, Alara countered. At least now I have power to fight back. She turned to address the assembled wolves, her voice carrying with authority she'd cultivated through weeks of practice, strengthened now by power that no longer had to strain against artificial barriers. I know what many of you are thinking. You're wondering if I'll use truth fire against you, if I'll expose your own lies and corruption, if having a flamebringer in the realm means you'll have to answer for things you've kept hidden. Several wolves shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing themselves in her words. But Ilara continued, her tone firm but not threatening. I'm not interested in destroying wolves who've made mistakes or hidden truths that harm only themselves. I'm interested in protecting the vulnerable from those who abuse power. So if you're an alpha who's been fair and just, if you're a wolf who's tried to do right even when it was difficult, you have nothing to fear from me. But her voice hardened, silver fire flickering brighter across her skin. If you're someone who uses power to crush those weaker than you, who maintains authority through fear and suppression, who binds children because you're afraid of what they might become, then yes, you should be afraid. Because I will expose you. I will use every gift the goddess gave me to reveal your corruption and ensure you can't hurt anyone else. The assembled wolves were silent, processing her declaration, measuring whether her threat was real or empty posturing. And Ilara knew, with certainty that came from newly freed instincts, that they believed her. That she'd just drawn a line in territory that had existed without clear boundaries for too long, forcing everyone to choose which side they wanted to be on. Elder Maris studied her for a long moment, something that looked almost like approval flickering across ancient features. You've chosen a difficult path, child. The kind that ends in either legend or tragedy, rarely anything in between. But the elder paused, choosing her next words carefully. Perhaps it's the path our kind needs. Perhaps we've grown too comfortable with corruption, too accepting of systems that crush the vulnerable to maintain order. Perhaps a Flamebringer's return is exactly the disruption we require. It wasn't quite endorsement, wasn't quite blessing, but it was closer than Ilara had expected from someone representing established authority. And it suggested that not all the old wolves were committed to maintaining the status quo, that some recognized change was necessary even if they couldn't initiate it themselves. The gathering dispersed slowly, wolves returning to their territories and responsibilities, carrying stories of what they'd witnessed. Some would spread fear about the Flamebringer's return, would paint Ilara as a threat requiring unified response. But others, especially the young, the designated weak, the wolves who'd never fit comfortably into pack hierarchy, would spread hope. Would whisper that maybe, finally, someone existed who could challenge the systems that had judged them worthless. Ilara stood in the ceremonial grounds as dawn gave way to full morning, as the sun climbed higher and burned away the last shadows of night. Kale remained at her side, his presence solid and grounding, his hand finding hers with easy familiarity that spoke of trust built through impossible circumstances. What happens now? He asked quietly, echoing her question from the night before. We've freed you, proven your power, drawn lines that can't be uncrossed. Where do we go from here? Ilara closed her eyes, reaching inward to where her wolf lived, no longer caged, no longer suppressed, just present and aware and ready. Now, she said, opening her eyes to meet his silver gaze, now we find others like me. Bound wolves who've been told they're broken when they're actually just suppressed. We free them. Train them. Build an army of wolves the old families tried to eliminate but couldn't quite destroy. An army, Kale repeated, something that looked like anticipation flickering across his features. Not for conquest, but for protection. For ensuring no child ever again gets bound because adults fear what they might become. Exactly, Ilara confirmed. We become what I needed when I was 6 years old, wolves powerful enough to stand against the system, compassionate enough to understand what suppression costs, determined enough to fight until things change. It was ambitious. Probably impossible. The kind of goal that would take years to accomplish, would face resistance from every established power structure, would require resources and allies they didn't yet possess. But looking at Kale, at his warriors who'd pledged themselves to similar ideals, at the wolves in the distance who'd found hope in her demonstration, Ilara believed it was possible. Believed that sometimes, the rejected and broken and insufficient could become exactly what the world needed, if only someone gave them the chance to try. The sun continued its climb, burning away morning mist, illuminating a world that looked exactly the same as yesterday but was fundamentally different. Because yesterday, Flamebringers were extinct, relegated to stories and warnings about power that couldn't be controlled. Today, one stood in the ceremonial grounds of Ironwood territory, silver fire flickering across her skin, promising that truth would no longer hide comfortably in shadows. Would you have chosen her side, knowing what it might cost? Would you have stood with the rejected Omega when everyone else called her broken? Would you have believed in power the old families feared enough to try eliminating from existence? Or would you have been one of the wolves who voted for execution, who filed false reports, who believed that some people are too dangerous to be allowed freedom, not because of what they've done, but because of what they might become? The answer matters. Because in every realm, in every system, there are wolves being bound before they can discover what they truly are. There are children being told they're defective when they're actually just threatening to structures that depend on their suppression. There are Flamebringers waiting to emerge, if only someone is brave enough to cut the threads holding them captive. Elara Winters was rejected, humiliated, marked for execution. But she survived. She burned. And now she's coming for every lie that lets predators hide among the vulnerable, every system that crushes potential to maintain order, every alpha who thought their authority was more important than truth. Are you ready to see what happens when fire finally breaks free? If this story lit something inside you, if you felt Elara's rage at being caged, her triumph at finally claiming her power, her determination to ensure no one else suffers what she endured, then subscribe to Shayla's Romance Library. Because here, in these stories, we don't just tell tales about wolves who survive impossible odds. We tell tales that burn. We give voice to the rejected, power to the broken, hope to wolves who've been told they're worthless their entire lives. We write stories where designations don't determine destiny, where the Omega everyone dismissed becomes the most dangerous wolf in the realm, where love means standing together against systems designed to keep you apart. So if you're tired of stories where the vulnerable stay victims, where power belongs only to those born into it, where challenging authority is painted as villainy rather than necessity, welcome home. Subscribe. Join us. Let's burn away every lie together. Because Elara's story isn't finished. She's just beginning to understand what Flamebringer power truly means, just starting to discover other bound wolves waiting for someone to free them, just beginning to challenge the families who thought they'd eliminated her kind forever. And you won't want to miss what happens when silver fire spreads across the entire realm, revealing truths no one wanted seen, igniting wolves who'd forgotten they were meant to burn. The ceremony is over. The binding is broken. The Flamebringer has risen. And the entire world is about to remember why they used to worship wolves who carried divine flame before fear taught them to destroy instead. Will you stand with her? Will you choose truth over comfortable lies? Will you burn? The choice is yours. But choose quickly, because the fire is already spreading and soon, there won't be anywhere left to hide from the light. Subscribe to Shayla's Romance Library, where the rejected become legends, where the broken become whole, where wolves who are meant to burn finally claim their flame. This is just the beginning.